During dinner, my wife reached across the table and enclosed both of my hands in hers. Her fingers were cold. She leaned closer and lowered her voice until it was barely more than a whisper. "Move all $60 million into your personal account tonight. Do not tell our son. Do not discuss it with anyone. And until this is over, trust no one." I stared at her, certain I had misunderstood. Before I could ask what she meant, her eyes shifted toward the dark hallway behind me. Then she added 5 words that would follow me for the rest of my life. "Within 48 hours, you'll understand." Less than 2 days later, my wife was gone. The morning after her funeral, our only son arrived at my home with his wife, a probate attorney, and a court order. The attorney placed a stack of legal documents on my coffee table while my son stood across from me with his hands in his pockets. I picked up the first page. By the time I finished reading the opening paragraph, every drop of blood seemed to drain from my body. Before we continue, I want to thank you for spending this time with me. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from. Your city, your state, or your country. I read those comments, and they mean more than you may realize. And when a story like this speaks to you, please support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. This story includes fictionalized elements created for entertainment and reflection. Any resemblance to actual individuals, businesses, or events is coincidental. But the lesson behind it is one every parent should remember. Sometimes the person who calls you family is the same person quietly preparing to destroy you. The kitchen smelled of rosemary, brown butter, and roasted garlic. That was how most Monday evenings smelled whenever my wife, Margaret Stafford, decided we deserved a proper meal instead of takeout from the Italian restaurant on Marengo Avenue. Everyone called her Peggy. I had set the dining table myself, using the good china we normally saved for anniversaries, holidays, and company. After 31 years of marriage, I had learned that when Peggy tied on her favorite apron and turned up the old jazz station, the least I could do was make an effort. I was 65 years old. For 3 decades, I had worked as a federal financial investigator. I chased corporate thieves across state lines, reconstructed fraudulent transactions, and helped build cases that sent wealthy men in expensive suits to prison. I had interviewed liars who could produce tears on command. I had studied ledgers designed to hide entire fortunes. I had watched respected executives swear on their families while concealing stolen money in offshore accounts. Very little surprised me anymore. And yet, sitting in that warm kitchen and watching Peggy quietly hum along with Chet Baker while checking the roast, I felt an almost embarrassing sense of peace. "You're staring again," she said without turning around. She always knew. "Guilty," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "Can you blame me?" She gave me that soft, warm laugh of hers. It began somewhere deep in her chest but rarely became loud enough for anyone outside the room to hear. She turned around and pointed the wooden spoon at me. 65 years old, and you're still trying to charm your way through dinner. It has worked for 31 years. Jean Stafford, you are a hopeless case. And you're only figuring that out now? She shook her head, smiling as she carried the roast to the table. The evening sunlight came through the dining room windows at that low California angle that made everything appear golden and almost sacred. It caught the silver in Peggy's hair. And I remember thinking, not for the first time, that Margaret Stafford was still the most beautiful woman I had ever known. She was 63, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime proving that she belonged in rooms where powerful men had initially assumed she did not. We ate slowly. We talked about the hydrangeas along the south fence, which were finally recovering from the summer heat. We discussed our friend Frank Colton's upcoming retirement dinner. We debated whether to drive to Carmel before the holidays or wait until spring, when the coastal fog would be lighter and the roads less crowded. To anyone listening from outside, the conversation would have sounded ordinary. To me, it was the entire purpose of a life. Then Peggy put down her fork. It was a small movement. She placed it carefully against the edge of her plate, as though it were made of glass and might break if she moved too quickly. But something inside me tightened. In 31 years of marriage, I had never seen Peggy stop eating in the middle of dinner unless something was seriously wrong. "Jean." Her voice had changed. The warmth that had been there only seconds earlier was gone. I leaned forward. "What is it?" She reached across the table and took my hand in both of hers. Her fingers were cold. Not the ordinary cold of someone who had been working near an open refrigerator. This cold came from somewhere deeper. "I need you to listen very carefully," she said. "And I need you to let me finish before you ask any questions. Can you do that?" My heart struck hard against my ribs. "Peggy, you're frightening me." "I know." She tightened her grip. "I'm frightened, too. That's why I'm telling you now." She drew a slow breath and straightened her back. I had seen her do that before board meetings and difficult negotiations. Whenever Peggy faced something intimidating, she lifted her chin, steadied her voice, and refused to let anyone see how much effort it required. "There is a durable power of attorney on file with Richard Boehm," she said. "I had it prepared 8 months ago. Richard was our estate attorney. The document gives you full legal authority to access and transfer every asset held in my name, including the private reserve fund." I opened my mouth. She lifted one finger. "Not yet. Please let me finish." I nodded. My throat had become so tight that I was not sure I could have spoken anyway. "The Callaway Reserve account contains approximately $60 million. If anything happens to me, I need you to transfer all of it into an account held solely in your name." I stared at her. She continued before I could respond. "Do it immediately. Do not wait for the banks to open the next morning. Do not call the board. Do not speak to the company's attorneys. And most importantly, do not call Douglas. The name of our son landed between us like a stone dropped into still water. Peggy. I don't trust him anymore." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. She pressed her lips together, trying to regain control, but her eyes had already filled with tears. That frightened me more than anything she had said. Margaret Stafford had built a $300 million investment firm from a rented office, a second-hand desk, and a yellow legal pad. She had faced hostile investors, market crashes, lawsuits, and men who mistook kindness for weakness. I had seen her angry. I had seen her disappointed. I had seen her exhausted. But I had almost never seen her afraid. "I don't have every piece yet," she said. "But I know enough to understand that we are in danger." "Danger from whom?" She shook her head. "Let me finish." I forced myself to remain silent. "You will understand the rest within 48 hours. 48 hours? Yes. Peggy, that isn't a conversation. That's a warning." She looked directly into my eyes. "Yes," she said. "It is." I pushed my chair back and walked around the table. Then I crouched beside her and held her face between my hands, the same way I had on the night I proposed in a tiny North Beach restaurant with a ring I could barely afford. Her eyes were wet. Seeing her that way struck me like a physical blow. "Talk to me," I said. "Whatever this is, we face it together. Tell me now." "Not yet." She rested her forehead against mine. "I need a little more time. Things must remain exactly as they are for just a little longer. Otherwise, none of this will work." She pulled away. There was something in her expression I had never seen during our entire marriage. Exhaustion. Fear. And the loneliness of someone who had been carrying a terrible secret by herself. "Promise me one thing," she said. "Anything." She stood and walked slowly toward the fireplace. On the mantel, between two framed family photographs, sat an antique Sessions clock from the 1920s. Peggy had discovered it in a crowded antique shop in Santa Barbara during our first anniversary trip. We could not afford it at the time, but she loved it. So we bought it anyway. That clock had moved with us through 4 houses and 31 years of marriage. Peggy lifted it carefully from the mantel and placed it on the dining table. "Do not let anyone take this," she said. I glanced at the clock and then back at her. "Why?" "Not Douglas. Not Renee. Not the attorneys. No one touches it." "Peggy, what is inside it?" She did not answer. "Promise me, Jean." I looked into her eyes. "I promise." She nodded once. Some of the tension left her shoulders, as though she had finally set down part of the burden she had been carrying. She squeezed my hand one last time. Then she returned to her chair, picked up her fork, and continued eating. I tried to do the same. But I could no longer taste anything on my plate. That night, I lay beside her in the darkness and listened to her breathe. Peggy had always slept deeply. When she decided to rest, she committed herself to it completely, as she did with almost everything else. My eyes remained fixed on the ceiling. Her warning repeated itself in my mind. Transfer the money. Do not call Douglas. Do not trust anyone. Protect the clock. Within 48 hours, you will understand. The digital clock beside the bed showed 2:47 in the morning when I heard her voice. It came from the bathroom down the hall. Faint. Strained. And filled with something that made every hair along the back of my neck rise. Jean. I was out of bed before she finished saying my name. She was lying on the bathroom floor. I struck my shoulder against the doorframe as I rushed inside, but I barely felt it. Every part of me was focused on the woman collapsed on the cold tile. One of her hands was pressed against the floor. The other gripped the edge of the vanity. Peggy. I dropped beside her so hard that both knees struck the tile. I slid an arm behind her shoulders. Her eyes found mine. The relief that crossed her face nearly broke me. Jean, she whispered. Something is wrong. My head. I can't. I've got you. I reached for my phone. I've got you, sweetheart. Don't try to move. I called 911 with one hand while keeping the other against her cheek. The dispatcher told me to keep her awake. So I talked. I told her help was coming. I told her to keep looking at me. I told her we were going to Carmel in the spring. I told her the hydrangeas still needed her. I kept talking because I was terrified that the moment I stopped, she would drift somewhere I could not follow. The paramedics arrived in 7 minutes. I know because I counted every one of them. Huntington Hospital was approximately 12 minutes away on empty streets. I followed the ambulance in my car, running 2 red lights and caring about neither one. At the emergency department, a nurse with kind eyes and a firm voice handed me a clipboard. She told me to sit down, complete the intake forms, and wait for the neurologist. I sat. I stared at the blank lines. For nearly 4 minutes, I could not make my hand write a single word because my fingers would not stop shaking. The neurology team worked on Peggy for 6 hours. I memorized every ceiling tile in that waiting room. I drank 3 cups of coffee that tasted like hot cardboard. At 5 in the morning, I called Frank Colton. Frank and I had worked together for 19 years in federal financial investigations. He was not a man who wasted words during a crisis. Peggy had a stroke, I told him. They're working on her now. There was a brief silence. I'm on my way. He ended the call before I could tell him not to come. 40 minutes later, he arrived carrying a paper bag filled with pastries neither of us touched. He sat beside me without asking unnecessary questions. That was exactly what I needed. At 6:17, the attending physician walked toward us. I recognized the pace immediately. Doctors have a particular way of approaching families when the news cannot be softened. My chest began to collapse before he even spoke. Mr. Stafford, I'm Dr. Okafor. He pulled a chair closer. I'm very sorry. The rest reached me through a roaring sound in my ears. Severe hemorrhagic stroke. Extensive neurological damage. She had not regained consciousness. The prognosis was poor. I had interviewed hundreds of criminals during my career. I had sat across from men who had stolen millions and watched them lie without feeling anything. But when Dr. Okafor told me that my wife might never wake up, the floor seemed to disappear beneath me. Frank caught my arm before I missed the chair. Peggy never regained consciousness. She passed away at 12:41 that afternoon with my hand wrapped around hers. Frank stood outside the doorway because he was decent enough to understand that a husband needed to be alone with his wife. I spoke to her until the final moment. I knew she probably could not hear me. I spoke anyway. I told her about the garden. I told her about the trip to Carmel we were still supposed to take. I told her how the morning light looked when it came through the kitchen window and rested against the countertop where she used to stand. I told her that 31 years had not been enough. I told her I was not ready. I told her I was angry with her for leaving me. And I told her I loved her so deeply that the word love felt completely inadequate. Then I dried my face on the sleeve of my shirt, stood up, and began doing exactly what she had asked me to do. Peggy's funeral was held at the Church of the Angels on Forest Avenue. It was a small Episcopal church with old stone walls and stained glass windows. She had not attended every Sunday, but she had always loved the place. The sanctuary filled with people from every chapter of her life. Former colleagues from her early years in venture capital. Members of the Stafford Capital Board. Neighbors from the street where we had lived for 2 decades. Women from the garden club who had known Peggy before she knew me. Douglas arrived 20 minutes before the service. I had not seen my son in 3 weeks. He was 38 years old, with my jaw and his mother's eyes. His dark suit fit perfectly. When he noticed me standing near the front of the church, he approached with one hand already extended. Not his arms. His hand. The way a man greets someone at a business conference. "Dad," he said. His handshake was firm and brief. "I'm sorry." His eyes were dry. His voice was controlled. I searched his face for the boy I had taught to throw a baseball. The boy I had driven to college. The young man I had stayed awake with during a terrible sophomore year when nothing in his life seemed to be going right. I believed that boy was still somewhere inside him. But he was buried beneath something I could not yet identify. "Thank you for coming," I said. It was the only sentence I trusted myself to complete. Renee appeared beside him. She was 35, dark-haired, impeccably dressed, and precise in the way certain intelligent people are precise. Nothing about her seemed wasted or accidental. Every movement appeared measured. Every expression looked carefully selected. She embraced me briefly. "We're here for you, Jean," she said, using exactly the appropriate amount of sympathy. Then she stepped back and linked her arm through Douglas's. During the service, I watched them. Douglas stared at the printed program as though he were studying a contract. Renee looked at the minister, the flowers, and the other mourners. But during the entire service, she never once looked at Peggy's casket. Not once. At the reception afterward, I held a cup of tea I did not want and watched Renee move through the room. She went from one group to another with practiced efficiency. She touched people lightly on the arm. She lowered her head at appropriate moments. She smiled when a memory required warmth and became solemn when grief was expected. She performed mourning the way a skilled attorney performs sincerity. Technically flawless. Emotionally empty. That night, after everyone had left, the house became quiet in the way only a newly empty house can. It was not an absence of sound. It was the absence of a person who had once filled every room. I sat at the kitchen table with the durable power of attorney in front of me. Peggy's voice repeated in my mind. "Transfer the $60 million. Do not wait. Do not consult anyone." I called Richard Baum at his private number. He confirmed that the power of attorney had been properly witnessed, notarized, and executed 8 months earlier. Under its terms, I had complete authority to access and transfer assets held in Peggy's name, including the full balance of the Callaway Reserve account. At 11:47 that night, I initiated the wire transfer. Every cent. I waited until the confirmation appeared on the screen. Then I turned off the kitchen light, climbed the stairs, and lay down on my side of the bed. I stared at the ceiling until the sky outside changed from black to gray and finally to the pale gold of a California morning. I did not know that a black sedan had already parked across the street. I did not know that the man in the passenger seat was a probate attorney named Warren Lyle. And I did not know that my son had made a telephone call on the same evening we buried his mother. I learned the truth the following afternoon. The doorbell rang shortly after 2. When I opened the door, Douglas was standing on the porch. For the first time in his life, he did not look like my son. He looked like a stranger. Beside him stood a silver-haired man carrying a leather briefcase. Renee waited one step behind them. The expression on Douglas's face was one I recognized from 30 years of investigative work. It was the expression of a man who had already decided how the confrontation would end. Warren Lyle had clearly spent years perfecting the art of delivering terrible news in a pleasant voice. He was approximately 50, with silver-streaked hair combed back from a carefully maintained face. His expression conveyed professional concern so polished that it almost reflected light. He stepped into my foyer without waiting to be invited. Then he placed his briefcase on the side table beside Peggy's coat. Her coat was still hanging on the rack. I had not been able to move it. "Mr. Stafford, my name is Warren Lyle. I am a probate attorney representing your son, Douglas, in a matter concerning the estate of Margaret Stafford." He opened the briefcase and removed a thick stack of documents. "I apologize for the timing. I understand this is an extraordinarily difficult period." He did not sound apologetic. He sounded like a man reading a statement he had repeated so many times that it no longer required any emotional involvement. I looked past him. Douglas stood in the entrance to my living room with his hands in his pockets and his jaw set. His eyes were fixed on a point above my left shoulder. Renee positioned herself 2 steps behind him and slightly to his right. The arrangement was so deliberate that it made the hair on my arms rise. "Douglas," I said. "Your mother has been buried for less than 24 hours. "I know, Dad." His voice was flat. "That's why this needs to happen quickly." Something inside my chest fractured. There was no dramatic sound. It felt more like old wood splitting quietly along a grain no one knew was there. I had held that man when he was 6 hours old. I had sat beside him through chickenpox, broken bones, school disappointments, and nights when he was certain his life would never improve. Now he was standing in my home, the day after his mother's funeral, telling me we needed to move quickly. "Please sit down," Lyle said, gesturing toward my own armchair. "This conversation will be easier if everyone remains comfortable." I did not sit. I crossed my arms and looked directly at him. "Tell me what you came here to say." Lyle placed the documents on the coffee table and turned them toward me. "Mr. Stafford, it is my client's position that the $60 million wire transfer initiated last night constitutes an act of undue influence and financial exploitation." The words struck like cold water. I heard them. I understood them. Then something began rising inside me. It was not anger. Not yet. It was colder than anger. And far more useful. "Undue influence," I repeated. "Martha." "Margaret," I corrected. He paused. "Margaret Stafford suffered a serious neurological event. Based on the available medical timeline, there is reason to believe that her judgment may have been impaired during the weeks preceding her death." "The power of attorney was executed 8 months ago," I said quietly. "It was witnessed, notarized, and filed by our estate attorney while Peggy was in full health. We are aware of the document." "Then you are aware that I had the legal authority to make the transfer." "The validity of that authority will be examined during probate proceedings." Douglas finally spoke. "You took advantage of Mom when she was vulnerable." His words were delivered with such cold precision that I felt them press against my chest. "She was afraid and confused, and you used that fear to take $60 million. I looked at him. "You believe that?" "You moved the money on the night she was buried. What would you call it?" "I call it honoring your mother's final instructions." "She was sick. She was lucid." My voice cracked slightly. I hated that it happened, but I did not look away. "She was more lucid than anyone standing in this room. She looked directly into my eyes and told me exactly what she needed me to do." "And what else did she tell you?" I stopped. Peggy had warned me not to move too quickly. She had said everything needed to remain as it was until the right moment. I swallowed the truth before it escaped. "She told me she loved you," I said. It was true. And it told him nothing. "She told me that every day." Renee stepped forward. She moved with the calm confidence of someone who had already calculated every variable in the room. She placed one hand on Douglas's arm. It was not affectionate. It was the way someone places a hand against a door to prevent it from swinging too far open. "Jean," she said, "we do not want this to become adversarial. You arrived at my home with an attorney and accused me of exploiting my dead wife. Douglas is grieving. We all are. But Stafford Capital's board has a fiduciary obligation. A transfer of this magnitude, made only hours after Margaret's death, cannot be ignored. Then investigate it through the proper channels." "That is precisely what we are doing," Lyle said. He removed another document from his briefcase. "This is an emergency order issued this morning by the Los Angeles County Superior Court." He placed it on the table with the care of a man laying down what he believed was a winning hand. "The order freezes all assets connected to the disputed transfer pending a full probate investigation. It also temporarily suspends your authority over accounts associated with Margaret Stafford's estate." I picked up the document. My hands remained steady. I was proud of that. I read the first 2 pages the way I had been trained to read legal records. Not for the language I expected. For the language someone hoped I would overlook. The order was genuine. A judge had signed it shortly after 9 that morning, fewer than 10 hours after I initiated the transfer. They had filed before the banks opened. "There is also the matter of the Pasadena residence," Lyle continued. His tone changed slightly. He had saved the worst for last. "The property is held in irrevocable trust. Douglas is listed as the primary beneficiary. Because of the pending investigation, my client has a legal obligation to secure the premises." I lowered the document. "What are you saying?" "You'll be required to vacate the property within 72 hours. The room appeared to tilt. "This is my home." My voice came out rough. "Peggy and I lived here for 20 years. The trust documents are clear. You're welcome to review them with your own counsel." He said it without cruelty. Indifference would have been easier to forgive if it had contained cruelty. Douglas finally looked directly at me. He had his mother's eyes. But at that moment, there was nothing of her behind them. "I'm sorry it has to happen this way, Dad." I searched the sentence for something sincere. I found only rehearsed language. I studied my son for a long moment. Then I looked at Renee. She was observing me with an expression of composed concern. Her eyes revealed nothing. I turned away and walked to the fireplace. The sessions clock stood between two photographs. One showed Peggy and me on our wedding day. The other showed the three of us at Douglas's college graduation. I lifted the clock from the mantel and turned it once in my hands. Then I slipped it carefully inside my jacket. Behind me, Renee inhaled sharply. It was not a word. Barely even a sound. But it was involuntary. I turned around. She was staring at the place where the clock had disappeared beneath my jacket. Something moved behind her eyes. Something quick. Hungry. And immediately concealed. But I had spent 30 years reading faces for a living. I had seen it. "I will leave within 72 hours, I said. "Any future communication will be delivered formally and through proper legal channels." I walked to the front door and opened it. Lyle gathered his documents. Douglas left without looking at me. Renee was the last one through the doorway. As she passed close enough for me to smell her perfume, her eyes dropped toward my jacket pocket. Only for an instant. Then she was gone. I remained in the doorway, staring into the empty afternoon. 2 nights earlier, Peggy had been humming in the kitchen. Now I stood alone in a house that no longer legally belonged to me. 3 days later, I checked into a motel near Union Station. The room cost $47 per night. Cash only. That was fortunate because cash was almost all I had left. I sat on the edge of the bed and counted the contents of my wallet. $82 and some change. A frozen credit card. And a driver's license displaying an address where I was no longer permitted to sleep. I placed the wallet on the nightstand and examined the room. A water-stained ceiling. A window air conditioner that rattled like something was trapped inside it. A television bolted to the dresser, presumably because someone had once attempted to steal it. Only a few days earlier, I had been sitting in my dining room with Peggy, eating rosemary roast and drinking Napa Valley Cabernet while Chet Baker played in the kitchen. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes until white light flashed behind my eyelids. Then I straightened my back and opened my laptop. The banking website loaded. I entered my credentials and selected the account. A message appeared. Access denied. Account frozen pursuant to court order. I tried our joint savings account. The same message appeared. I tried the brokerage account I had maintained independently since before my marriage. Frozen. Lyle had not limited the order to Peggy's estate. He had swept every account connected to my name into the freeze with the thoroughness of a man who had done this before. I walked to the vending machine at the end of the hallway. I fed a crumpled $5 bill into the slot and bought a package of peanut butter crackers and a bottle of water. Then I stood beneath the fluorescent lights eating crackers that tasted like salted cardboard while a stranger's television murmured through the wall. I was 65 years old. I held a master's degree in financial forensics. I had served the federal government for 3 decades. I had led 11 major corporate fraud investigations and helped secure a combined 43 years in prison sentences. And I was eating dinner from a vending machine because my only son had obtained a court order before his mother's grave had settled. That was when the anger finally came. It was not loud. It did not make me throw the water bottle or strike the wall. It arrived cleanly. Coldly. And with extraordinary clarity. I returned to the room, sat at the small desk, and called Frank Colton. He answered on the second ring. "Gene, where are you?" "A motel near Union Station. Room 7. There was a short pause. "Are you all right?" "No." I looked at the stained ceiling. "But I'm functional. Frank, I need you." "I'm listening." "Not tomorrow. Not after breakfast. I need you here now. Bring your laptop. Bring the financial tracking software. The old federal suite. Bring everything. I could already hear him moving. Keys being lifted from a hook. A door opening. I'll be there as soon as I can. Frank. Yes? Do not tell anyone where you're going. His voice lowered. She told you something, didn't she? My throat tightened. At dinner. Before the stroke. Yes, I said. She did. Then we're going to find out what she knew. He said it the way Frank always said difficult things. Without drama. Without exaggeration. With the calm certainty of a man who had never made a promise he did not intend to keep. He ended the call. I set the phone down and reached inside my jacket. The sessions clock rested in my palm. It felt cool and solid. Lighter than it appeared. I turned it over and examined the back panel. There was a faint line along the lower left edge where the casing did not sit completely flush. Beside it was a tiny curved scratch. The kind of mark a fingernail leaves when searching for a hidden seam. Peggy had concealed something inside the clock. I was certain of it. And someone else knew it, too. Because 20 minutes earlier, when I returned from the motel hallway, my door had been unlocked. I clearly remembered locking it. The deadbolt had been disengaged. Whoever entered had either picked the lock or obtained a key from the front desk. At first glance, nothing seemed to be missing. But the zipper on my duffel bag had been moved several inches. The pillow on the left side of the bed was no longer where I had left it. The drawer beside the television was slightly open. Someone had searched the room. They were not looking for cash. They were looking for something small. Something I had taken from the house. I wrapped both hands around the clock and held it against my chest. Outside, the lights of Los Angeles pressed against the motel window. A siren sounded somewhere in the distance. A freight train began pulling away from Union Station. The city continued moving, completely unaware that a 65-year-old widower was sitting in a $47 room, holding the last secret his wife had entrusted to him. Frank was on his way. Until he arrived, I had only one responsibility. Keep the clock safe. Because whatever Peggy had hidden inside it was important enough for her to protect with her final warning. And dangerous enough that someone had already broken into my room to find it. Frank Colton arrived 38 minutes after we ended the call. That meant he had driven from Pasadena to the motel near Union Station in traffic that should have taken close to an hour. He knocked using the signal we had relied on during our federal years. 2 quick knocks, followed by a third after a short pause. I opened the door with the antique clock still tucked beneath my jacket. Frank took one look at me and stopped in the doorway. "You look terrible," he said. "Good evening to you, too. I mean medically terrible, not personally offensive. That is comforting." He stepped inside, locked the door behind him, and placed a heavy canvas bag on the dresser. From it, he removed 2 large cups of coffee, a laptop, several external drives, a portable router, and enough charging cables to power a small government office. Frank had assembled workstations in hotel rooms, rental cars, warehouse offices, and once in the back of an abandoned laundry truck during a securities investigation in Phoenix. A $47 motel room did not impress him. He handed me one of the coffees. "Sit down before you fall down." "I'm not going to fall." "You have the same look you used to get after 30 hours of surveillance. Your body is standing, but your judgment has already gone home." I sat at the small desk beside him. The coffee was strong, bitter, and exactly what I needed. I wrapped both hands around the paper cup and allowed the warmth to move into my fingers. For the first time since leaving the house, something inside my chest loosened slightly. Frank was 67, 2 years older than I was. His hair had turned completely white, though he still had all of it. His reading glasses usually rested on his forehead until the moment he needed them, at which point he would spend several seconds searching his pockets before remembering where they were. He had the unhurried precision of a man who had spent his entire adult life locating the one dishonest number inside 10,000 honest ones. We had worked together for 19 years in the Financial Crimes Enforcement Division. He was the best forensic accountant I had ever known. More importantly, he was the only living person I trusted without reservation. He opened his laptop and looked at me. "Start with the dinner." "Frank." "Start with Peggy putting her fork down. Tell me every word you remember. Do not summarize. Do not decide what matters before you say it. Let me decide what matters." It was the same instruction we had given witnesses for 3 decades. So I told him everything. I described the rosemary roast, the music playing in the kitchen, And the conversation about the garden. I told him how Peggy's fingers had felt when she took my hand. Cold. I repeated her instructions about the durable power of attorney and the $60 million in the Callaway Reserve account. I told him she had warned me not to speak to Douglas. I told him about the clock. I described the stroke, the hospital, the funeral, Douglas arriving with Warren Lyle, the court order, and Renee's reaction when I removed the clock from the mantel. Then I told him about the motel room. The unlocked door. The altered zipper on my bag. The moved pillow. Frank listened without interrupting. That was one of his great professional gifts. When he gave someone his attention, he became completely still. No impatient movements. No meaningless nodding. No glances toward a clock. When I finished, he waited 4 seconds before speaking. She knew she was running out of time. Yes. And she deliberately kept you from knowing the full story. The statement hurt more than I expected. I believe so. Frank leaned back and studied me over the top of his glasses. Why? I don't know. Yes, you do. I looked down at the coffee cup. If she had told me Douglas was involved in something criminal, I would have confronted him. How quickly? Immediately. And then? They would have moved the money, deleted the records, and altered the authorization trail. Frank nodded. She protected the evidence by protecting your ignorance. I stared at him. The sentence was clinical, but the truth inside it was devastating. Peggy had understood me better than anyone. She knew that if she placed evidence of our son's betrayal in front of me, I would not have waited. I would have demanded answers. I would have walked into Douglas's office, closed the door, and asked him what he had done. And if Renee was even half as calculating as I suspected, she would have recognized the danger before I finished my first sentence. Records would have disappeared. Money would have moved. Witnesses would have been pressured. The entire case would have dissolved before it had a chance to exist. She carried it alone, I said. Yes. For months. Yes. My throat tightened. That is either the most sophisticated investigative decision I have ever seen, or the most heartbreaking. Frank's expression softened. It can be both. I looked toward the bed where the clock rested beneath my folded jacket. I haven't opened it. Good. You don't think we should? I think someone searched this room for it. Until we know who and how, I do not want us opening anything that may contain the only original copy of evidence. We secure it first. Then we examine it under controlled conditions. You always did know how to delay the interesting part. That is why I survived 35 years without contaminating evidence. He connected his laptop to the portable router. All right, he said. Let's see what they built. 3 months earlier, Peggy had asked me to create a backup of Stafford Capital Group's financial records. She had made the request casually one Saturday morning while we were drinking coffee on the back patio. She said the company was changing its data management system and that she wanted an independent copy of the prior 4 years of transactions, internal authorizations, vendor contracts, and quarterly filings. At the time, I had assumed she was being cautious. Peggy believed that valuable records should exist in more than one place. I had downloaded the information, encrypted it, and stored it on an external drive in my home office. When I left the house, I brought the drive with me. Now I understood that she had not been concerned about a software transition. She had been preserving a crime scene. I placed the encrypted drive beside Frank. He connected it and began comparing its contents with Stafford Capital's public financial disclosures. He opened quarterly reports, tax filings, vendor summaries, board minutes, and operating expense schedules. He arranged the windows across the laptop screen in a pattern only he could understand. For 40 minutes, he barely spoke. His fingers moved steadily across the keyboard. Every few minutes, he stopped, adjusted his glasses, and leaned toward the screen. I watched him work. Outside, a freight train moved away from Union Station. Its horn sounded low and distant, shaking the motel window in its frame. The air conditioner rattled above us. Someone argued in the parking lot. Inside room 7, Frank followed the money. At last, he sat back. He removed his glasses and placed them beside the computer. Jean. The way he said my name told me he had found something. What is it? There are 6 consulting contracts listed in Stafford Capital's operating expenses over the last 4 years. What kind of consulting? That is the first problem. The descriptions are deliberately vague. Strategic planning, international market development, regulatory positioning, corporate risk analysis. Who approved them? Douglas. The answer entered my chest like a thin blade. Frank continued. He used the standing signatory authority Peggy granted him for routine operating expenses. How much? Combined disbursements of just under $18.4 million. I said nothing. Frank turned the laptop toward me. The transactions appeared in a long column. No single payment exceeded $98,000. Most ranged between $72,000 and $96,000. They had been made at irregular intervals over 41 months, sometimes 2 in 1 week, sometimes none for 6 weeks. The structure was intentional. Internal secondary review begins at $100,000, I said. Exactly. They kept every transfer beneath the automatic trigger. Every one. Smurfing. Frank nodded. It was an old laundering technique. Break a large amount into smaller transactions to avoid reporting requirements and internal controls. Whoever designed the system understood Stafford Capital's audit thresholds. That meant the person had access to the company's financial controls. Or access to someone who did. Show me the vendors, I said. Frank opened the contract directory. The first company was Crestline Advisory Limited Liability Company. The second was Pacific Rim Consulting Group. Then Westlake Strategic Partners, Meridian Corporate Solutions, Redfield International Advisors, and Harbor Point Development Services. The names were polished, respectable, and intentionally forgettable. They sounded like companies whose representatives would wear navy suits, carry leather portfolios, and speak for an hour without saying anything that could later be measured. Run Crestline, I said. Frank searched the Delaware corporate registry. Crestline Advisory had been incorporated in February 4 years earlier. Its registered agent was a legal services office in Las Vegas. No officers were publicly listed. Its business address led to a mailbox inside a shipping store on Flamingo Road. No employees, Frank said. No payroll reports. No commercial lease. No website before the contract date. No professional licenses. Run Pacific Rim. Registered in Nevada. Same Las Vegas agent. No staff. No operating address. No evidence the company had performed a single legitimate service. Westlake Strategic Partners had been formed in Delaware. Same registered agent. Meridian Corporate Solutions was registered in Nevada. Same agent. Redfield and Harbor Point followed the same pattern. 6 separate companies. 2 states. 1 registration office. 1 individual listed as the filing representative for 47 other limited liability companies created during the same 14-month period. They are shells, Frank said. Every one of them. Yes. No employees? None. No services? None that I can document. No clients besides Stafford Capital? Not one. I leaned back. $18.4 million had left Peggy's company disguised as consulting fees. Douglas's approval appeared on every transaction. I thought of him at the funeral. His dry eyes. His controlled voice. His hand extended instead of his arms. I had wanted to believe grief affected people differently. I had wanted to believe he was in shock. Now I wondered whether he had been mourning his mother at all, or simply calculating how quickly her death would allow him to complete what he had started. Follow the money, I said. Frank opened the banking reference files. The payments did not remain in the 6 shell accounts. Within days, sometimes hours, each transfer was divided again. The funds moved into a second group of corporations registered in Panama. Those companies had names in Spanish and English, directors who appeared on hundreds of other filings, and addresses connected to office buildings where no one answered the telephone. From Panama, the money fractured into smaller transfers routed through private accounts in Switzerland. The transaction descriptions changed. Consulting fees became licensing payments. Licensing payments became loan repayments. Loan repayments became international asset purchases. Each change created another layer between the stolen money and the person who intended to use it. Frank studied the routing sequence. Whoever constructed this knew what they were doing. Professional? Either professional or very well advised. Could Douglas have built it? Frank considered the question. Your son understands corporate finance. But this structure requires more than knowing how accounts work. It requires knowing how investigators work. Renee. I'm not making that conclusion yet. You're thinking it. I am thinking we need evidence. Frank had spent his career refusing to fall in love with a theory before the documents supported it. That discipline had made him valuable. It had also made him extremely irritating when the obvious answer was sitting in front of us. He searched Renee's corporate history. Her full legal name was Renee Marie Stafford. Before marrying Douglas, she had been Renee Marie Calloway. Calloway. The same name used for the $60 million reserve account. I had always assumed Peggy named the fund after Renee's family because the original investment vehicle had been created during the year Douglas married her. Now the choice felt different. Perhaps Peggy had named it that way to mark the money she suspected Renee would eventually try to reach. Frank entered the maiden name into several state regulatory databases. A result appeared from Georgia. He stopped typing. What? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he opened the record and read it carefully. Renee Calloway was connected to a securities fraud investigation in Atlanta 10 years ago. I leaned closer. Connected how? She worked as operations director for a private wealth management firm. The company was accused of routing client money through unauthorized consulting entities. The room became very quiet. How much? Just over $6 million. Was she charged? No. The primary witness withdrew her statement 14 months after the investigation began. Without that testimony, the state closed the case. Who is the witness? A senior accountant employed by the firm. What happened to her? Frank searched. She left Georgia. No current professional license. No public employment record after the case. Paid off? Possibly. Threatened? Possibly. Or both. Frank looked at me. Probably both. The method described in the Georgia complaint was nearly identical to what we were seeing inside Stafford Capital. Invented consultants. Payments below internal review thresholds. Layered transfers through multiple jurisdictions. A trusted executive providing authorization. And a witness who became too frightened or too compromised to continue. She has done this before, I said. Yes. And she learned from the first investigation. Yes. She corrected the weaknesses. Frank's eyes remained on the screen. She appears to have. We did not sleep. Around 2 in the morning, Frank crossed the street to a gas station and returned with fresh coffee, 2 bananas, and a package of crackers. We continued working beneath the yellow light of the desk lamp. The motel around us settled into the uneasy silence of a place where people came to disappear temporarily. Doors opened and closed. Cars arrived, idled, and departed. Somewhere upstairs, plumbing groaned inside the wall. None of it mattered. Frank lined up the incorporation dates for the 6 shell companies. Crestline had been created first, on February 14th. He stared at the date. Valentine's Day, he said. What year? He told me. A thought moves through my mind slowly, gathering weight. When did Douglas and Renee marry? Frank searched the public record. November of the previous year. 3 months. Yes. I stood and walked toward the window. The parking lot was washed in orange streetlight. A semi-truck idled near the far fence. A pigeon picked at something beside the dumpster with the determined concentration of a creature that had abandoned all concern for appearances. She started preparing 3 months after the wedding. That is what the filing date suggests. She married him, learned the company's authorization system, identified the audit threshold, and created the first shell. Frank pressed both palms against the desk. It was a gesture I recognized. He was steadying himself before saying something he knew would hurt. Jean, I do not believe Renee fell in love with your son and later discovered an opportunity. I kept my eyes on the parking lot. Say it. I believe she identified the opportunity first. The air conditioner rattled. A truck shifted gears on the street. I thought of the first evening Douglas brought Renee to our home. He had been 25, though he seemed younger when she looked at him. He watched her with the helpless admiration of a man who had finally received the exact kind of attention he had wanted his entire life. She had been charming that night. Not excessively charming. That would have made Peggy suspicious. She was curious, respectful, and warm in carefully measured proportions. She asked about my federal work without appearing impressed by it. She asked Peggy about building Stafford Capital and listened as though every answer mattered. She complimented the house, but not the expensive parts. She helped clear the table without being asked. At the time, I thought she was sincere. Now I understood that sincerity might have been the first service she ever sold us. Douglas was the vehicle, Frank said quietly. Not the destination. No. He gave her access to Peggy, the company, and the money. Yes. I closed my eyes. I wanted to hate Douglas completely. Hatred would have been simpler. But beneath the anger was another truth. My son might have begun as a victim. He might have been selected, studied, and manipulated by someone who understood exactly what he needed to hear. But at some point, he had learned enough to know the money was stolen. At some point, he had signed the approvals. At some point, he had chosen the conspiracy over his mother. Whatever role he played at the beginning did not erase the decisions he made afterward. "Keep going," I said. Frank followed the Swiss transfers. The accounts ultimately reconsolidated into a master trust registered in the Cayman Islands. The trust was protected by layers of nominee directors and confidentiality provisions. From the outside, it appeared to be a lawful international asset-holding structure. Internally, it was designed to make beneficial ownership difficult to establish without cooperation from foreign authorities. "The Cayman Trust is the endpoint," Frank said. "Can you open it?" "Not legally from here." "I did not ask whether you could open it legally." He looked at me over his glasses. "You have been retired too long. You are developing poor habits. I learned them from you." "That is slander." He reached into his canvas bag and removed a small encrypted drive. During his federal years, Frank had helped develop software used to identify hidden ownership relationships in offshore corporate networks. After leaving government work, he retained a licensed commercial version for his consulting practice. At least, that was the explanation he gave me. I did not ask for documentation. Some questions between old partners are better left unanswered. The program processed the trust's registration data for 22 minutes. Frank and I ate the vending machine crackers while the progress bar moved slowly across the screen. We discussed nothing important. He complained about the coffee. I told him no one forced him to purchase coffee from a gas station at 2 in the morning. He said marriage had made me judgmental. I told him remaining unmarried had made him impossible. Then the screen changed. A trust administration document appeared. Frank leaned forward. He read the beneficiary listing once silently. Then he read it again aloud. Cayman Trust number 774B. Joint beneficiaries, Douglas Allen Stafford and Renee Marie Stafford. I stopped chewing. Ownership distribution? Frank's voice went flat. 60% Renee. 40% Douglas. Even inside their hidden account, Renee had made certain she controlled the majority. I walked back to the window. My chest felt hollow, like a large room after every piece of furniture has been removed. $18.4 million had been stolen from the company Peggy built. Douglas's digital authorization appeared on each payment. Renee's methods appeared in every shell corporation, every intermediary account, and every legal structure separating the money from its origin. And Peggy had known. She had sat across from me at our dining table, frightened and exhausted, carrying the knowledge that our son's name appeared on the theft of her life's work. She had known that his wife designed the mechanism. She had known the company she created from a rented office and a legal pad was being dismantled from the inside. Yet she had continued going to work. She had continued attending meetings. She had continued sitting across from Douglas and Renee as though she suspected nothing. She had carried that knowledge home each evening and protected me from it until she could no longer safely do so. My forehead touched the cold window glass. I breathed slowly. "Jean." Frank's voice came from behind me. "Your phone." The phone was vibrating on the nightstand. One notification became 3. Then 6. Then more arrived so quickly that the screen seemed to remain permanently illuminated. I picked it up. Douglas had posted a video 40 minutes earlier. The view count was already climbing into the thousands. I opened it. My son was sitting in my living room. Behind him was the fireplace where Peggy's clock had stood. He wore a dark sweater instead of a suit, an intentional choice designed to make him appear less corporate and more vulnerable. His eyes were red. Whether from genuine grief, deliberate rubbing, or lack of sleep, I could not tell. He looked directly into the camera. "My family has experienced an unimaginable loss," he began. His voice broke slightly. Not too much. Just enough. My mother devoted her life to her family, her employees, and the company she built. During her final days, when she was medically vulnerable and unable to protect herself, my father pressured her into granting him control over a private reserve account. I felt Frank watching me. I kept my eyes on the screen. The night we buried her, he transferred $60 million into an account under his personal control. Douglas paused. He looked down, gathered himself, and continued. We are devastated. We are heartbroken. We never imagined that grief could be accompanied by this kind of betrayal. Our attorneys have taken steps to protect my mother's estate, and we are asking the court to ensure that justice is done. Renee appeared beside him near the end. She placed a hand on his shoulder and looked at him with grave concern. It was the same way she had touched his arm in my living room. Not affection. Control. The comments beneath the video were a wall of outrage. Strangers called me a thief. A predator. An abusive husband. A man who had exploited a dying woman. Former employees of Stafford Capital shared the video with messages expressing shock. A woman who had eaten Thanksgiving dinner at our home wrote that she had always sensed something disturbing about me. I had known her for 15 years. Apparently, she had concealed her concern extremely well. I placed the phone face down. My hands were shaking. Not from fear. The shaking came from a fury so concentrated that it felt electrical. I had spent 30 years building a reputation for honesty, restraint, and careful judgment. In 3 minutes, my son had reduced that life to a performance designed for people who would never meet me and never know Peggy. They are controlling the narrative, Frank said. I know. They prepared this before the funeral. I know. The camera position, the language, the timing, the legal references. This was not spontaneous. I know, Frank. My voice came out harder than I intended. He did not react. He had known me too long to confuse anger with disrespect. I turned the phone over again. The notifications continued. So what do we do? I asked. Frank returned his hands to the keyboard. We take the story back. How? One transaction at a time. By 7 that morning, Douglas's video had been shared more than 4,000 times. By 9, the allegations had reached local television. A morning news program displayed an old photograph of me from a Stafford Capital charity dinner. In the original image, I was smiling beside Peggy. The television station cropped her out. Beneath my face, the headline read, Pasadena widower accused of exploiting late wife. The anchor explained that the allegations had not been proven. Then the program spent 4 minutes discussing them as though they had. Frank and I watched from the edge of the motel bed. They moved quickly, he said. They had the media package ready. The photograph. The legal summary. The family statement. This is a campaign. My phone vibrated again. The message came from Gerald Hutchinson, a man who had played golf with Peggy and me every third Sunday for 11 years. It read, Gene, I saw the news. I do not know what to say. I hope there is an explanation. There was no question mark. Only a period. In 11 years of friendship, Gerald had never used a period where a question mark belonged. The punctuation told me he had already reached a conclusion. I put the phone down. Frank picked it up and returned it to my hand. You need to see everything they sent. Why? Because some of these people may become witnesses later. Some may reveal who contacted them. Others may repeat language that originated with Renee's attorneys. Patterns matter. It feels like reading my own obituary written by people who dislike me. Read it anyway. He was right. I opened the messages. There were 14 from people I knew. Former colleagues. Neighbors. 2 members of Peggy's garden club. An associate from my federal career. The tone ranged from cautious concern to open accusation. Every sender had watched Douglas's video before contacting me. Every one of them had formed a preliminary judgment before hearing a word from my side. I read each message. I responded to none. There was no sentence I could send from a motel room that would compete with a carefully produced video recorded in my own home. The truth would require documents. Until we had enough documents, silence was the only useful response. We returned to the financial records. Frank was cross-referencing the shell company payments with Stafford Capital's tax filings when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Los Angeles area code. I considered allowing it to go to voicemail. Something made me answer. Jean Stafford. Mr. Stafford? The caller was a woman. Her voice was low and controlled, but a slight tremor moved beneath it. The tremor did not sound weak. It sounded like fear being forced to behave. Yes. My name is Sandra Kowalski. I worked for Stafford Capital as executive administrative assistant to Mrs. Stafford. I sat straighter. Across the desk, Frank looked up. Sandra continued. I was terminated 8 weeks ago. I remember Peggy mentioning you. She spoke about you? Often. She trusted you. Sandra was silent for a moment. Then she drew a breath. Mrs. Stafford gave me your private number approximately 4 months ago. Why? She said that if anything happened to her, and if I saw something that frightened me, I should call you. The sentence tightened every muscle in my body. What did you see? I saw the video this morning. That is not what I asked. I know. Her voice became quieter. Mr. Stafford, when they terminated me, I signed a non-disclosure agreement. Who presented it? Warren Lyle. Of course. He came to my office with a representative from Human Resources. They offered me $40,000 in severance if I signed immediately. And if you refused? They said the company would investigate me for unauthorized access to confidential systems. Had you accessed anything outside your job responsibilities? I had looked at records they did not want me to see. That is different from records you had no authority to see. I know that now. She paused. At the time, I was frightened. My husband had been laid off. My daughter was starting college. I needed the severance money. You do not need to apologize for surviving a threat. The line went quiet. When she spoke again, her voice had softened. Mrs. Stafford said you would understand. What did they not want you to see? About 3 months before Mrs. Stafford died, Renee brought in a new physician to oversee her care. What physician? Dr. Gerald Finch. I looked toward Frank. He was already writing the name. Sandra continued. Renee told Mrs. Stafford that the company's executive health plan would cover a private medical retainer. She said Dr. Finch specialized in managing cardiovascular risk for senior executives. Did Peggy request a new physician? Not that I knew. She already had a cardiologist and a primary care doctor she trusted. How did Finch enter the company's system? I processed the initial payment authorization. How much? $1.5 million for a 1-year consulting retainer. Even Frank stopped writing. For one physician? The payment did not go directly to him. It went to a company called Pacific Health Consulting Partners. Was it an approved vendor? No. Did it appear in Stafford Capital's vendor database? No. That is why I asked questions. What did Renee say? She said it was a new executive wellness vendor and that the details were above my level. And then you investigated. I checked the corporate registration. Good. Sandra released a shaky breath. I thought I was being disloyal. No. You were doing your job. The company was registered 6 weeks before the payment. It had no medical office address. No employees were listed. Dr. Finch was the only officer. Did you tell Peggy? Not immediately. I wanted more than a suspicion. What happened next? I saw Renee and Dr. Finch meeting privately. Where? The small conference room on the 14th floor. Why does that matter? It is the only conference room in that section without a security camera. Frank and I exchanged a look. Could you hear them? No. The door was almost closed. I walked past and saw them through the opening. What did you observe? They were not discussing Mrs. Stafford's health. How can you be certain? Sandra hesitated. Because I scheduled hundreds of medical meetings, board meetings, and vendor discussions. People behave differently depending on what they are discussing. Describe the difference. Dr. Finch had a folder open in front of him. Renee was pointing to a document and speaking very quietly. He looked nervous. She did not. Anything else? She slid an envelope across the table. What kind of envelope? Small. Wide. Thick enough to hold documents or possibly cash. Did Finch take it? Yes. How long before you were terminated? Approximately 6 weeks. I kept my voice steady. Sandra, do you have documentation? The pause lasted long enough that I checked whether the call had disconnected. Then she answered. I have screenshots. Frank rose from his chair. How many? 11. What do they show? Payment authorizations, calendar entries, changes to Mrs. Stafford's medication records, and internal emails. My heart began beating harder. Where are the screenshots stored? On an old phone I kept disconnected from the company network. When they terminated me, the information technology department remotely wiped my work devices. They could not reach this one. Good. There is one email in particular. Between whom? Renee and Dr. Finch. When was it sent? 19 days before Mrs. Stafford died. What does it say? Sandra's voice dropped until it was barely above a whisper. It says, the timeline needs to move faster. We are running out of room. The motel room seemed to shrink around me. The air conditioner continued rattling. Traffic moved outside. A door slammed somewhere along the walkway. But those ordinary sounds felt distant. All I could hear was the sentence Sandra had repeated. The timeline needs to move faster. We are running out of room. Mr. Stafford? I'm here. I should have called sooner. You called when you were able. I was afraid. You had reason to be. I still am. I looked at Frank. His face had lost its color. Sandra, I need to meet you today. Where? Choose a public location where you feel safe. Do not come to this motel. Do not go near Stafford Capital. Do not tell anyone you contacted me. There is a coffee shop on Valley Boulevard in Alhambra. What time? 11:15. We will be there. We? Frank Colton is with me. She exhaled. Mrs. Stafford mentioned him, too. I'm not surprised. Mr. Stafford? Yes? I am sorry about what happened to her. The kindness nearly broke through the discipline I had been holding around myself. I closed my eyes. So Madge. We ended the call. Frank immediately searched Dr. Gerald Finch. He was 58, licensed in California, with a background in internal medicine and executive health management. His record appeared respectable at first. Then Frank found disciplinary proceedings from 9 years earlier involving improper prescribing and failure to disclose financial relationships with a pharmaceutical company. The medical board had suspended his license for 6 months. He later returned to private practice. Financial pressure? I asked. Possibly. His practice filed for bankruptcy 3 years ago. Debts? Substantial. Renee found a physician who needed money. And who already had a history of crossing ethical lines. I looked toward the clock beneath my jacket. What did they do to her? Frank did not answer. Neither of us was ready to say the possibility aloud. The coffee shop Sandra selected had mismatched wooden chairs, a handwritten menu, and no corporate logo. It looked as though the same family had operated it for 20 years and had resisted every suggestion that they modernize. Sandra had chosen the corner booth farthest from the windows. When Frank and I entered at 11:15, she was already seated with her back against the wall. A cup of tea rested untouched in front of her. She held an older model phone in both hands. Sandra was 44. Dark circles showed beneath her eyes despite an effort to conceal them. Her gray cardigan was buttoned incorrectly at the bottom, suggesting she had dressed while distracted. She watched the entrance with the careful posture of someone who had spent several weeks expecting to be followed. When she saw us, she began to stand. "Please remain seated," I said. She settled back into the booth. Frank took the chair at the end of the table, positioning himself so he could see both the entrance and the rear hallway. It was an old field habit. Neither of us had ever completely abandoned those habits. "Thank you for meeting us," I told her. "I understand this was not easy." Her eyes filled immediately. The tears did not fall. They gathered and remained there while she fought to control her breathing. Mrs. Stafford was good to me. She was good to many people. She remembered everyone's birthday. She knew the names of our children. When my husband was hospitalized, she called me every evening for a week. That sounds like Peggy. Sandra looked down at the tea. When Renee started controlling administrative operations, everything changed. How quickly? Slowly enough that most people did not notice. Explain. First, she reorganized the executive assistant team. Then she changed who could access calendars and vendor files. Later, She required all department heads to route certain decisions through her office. Which decisions? External consulting contracts, executive health expenses, international transfers, and technology access. The exact categories needed to operate the scheme. She isolated the information, Frank said. Sandra nodded. She made certain no one employee could see the whole picture. Except you. Not at first. But executive assistants notice patterns. We know who meets privately. We know which documents arrive outside normal channels. We know when someone who never closes a door suddenly begins closing it. Did Peggy notice? Yes. How do you know? Her questions changed. She began asking me for duplicate copies of vendor schedules. She requested calendar histories instead of current calendars. She asked whether meeting records could be restored after deletion. She was building a timeline. I believe so. Why didn't she confront Renee? Sandra looked at me. Because Renee is very skilled at making other people appear unstable. I waited. Sandra continued. When someone questioned her, she never became angry. She became concerned. Concern? She would lower her voice and ask whether the person was under unusual stress. She would suggest they take time away. Then she would document the conversation as a workplace wellness issue. Frank's expression hardened. She created records questioning their judgment. Yes. By the time they challenged her openly, she had already built a file suggesting they were emotionally unreliable. And Warren Lyles supported it? He reviewed the documentation. Sandra's hands tightened around the phone. I think Mrs. Stafford understood that if she moved too early, Renee would use her previous arterial event to argue that she was confused or impaired. The same argument they were now using against me. She needed proof strong enough that concern could not explain it away, I said. Yes. She was protecting the company. And the employees. Sandra's voice broke. I believe she was protecting all of us. Frank leaned forward. May we see the screenshots? Sandra unlocked the old phone. Before sliding it across the table, she looked at me. Once I give you this, I cannot take it back. You are not giving it to me. She frowned. You are allowing us to review it. We will make a forensic copy only with your written permission. The original device will remain with you until federal investigators can receive it properly. Federal investigators? If the evidence shows what you believe it shows, this is larger than a probate dispute. She swallowed. Will I be arrested for taking the screenshots? No. How can you be certain? Because you had authorized access to the records in the course of your employment. Preserving evidence of potential criminal activity is not the same as stealing proprietary information for personal benefit. Frank added, and a non-disclosure agreement cannot prevent you from reporting a crime. Sandra blinked. Warren Lyles said speaking about anything related to the company could expose me to legal action. That was misleading, Frank said. An agreement may protect legitimate confidential business information. It cannot lawfully prevent cooperation with law enforcement. He said they could take my house. Something cold moved through me. Did he use those exact words? Yes. Did anyone else hear him? The Human Resources Director was present. Write down everything you remember about that meeting. The date, time, location, names, and exact phrases. Why? Because threatening financial ruin to prevent a witness from reporting possible criminal activity may be considered obstruction or witness intimidation. Her eyes widened. For the first time since we sat down, some of the tension left her shoulders. Not all of it. But enough for her to breathe more deeply. She slid the phone toward me. The screenshots were arranged chronologically. The first 6 showed payments from a Stafford Capital expense account to Pacific Health Consulting Partners. The payments covered 7 months. The amounts varied between $80,000 and $240,000. Each transfer carried Renee's digital authorization. The descriptions included executive medical coordination, specialized risk assessment, and confidential health management services. No supporting reports were attached. No medical invoices explained the charges. No treatment schedule justified the amounts. The 7th screenshot showed Renee's corporate calendar. A meeting was labeled Medical Coordination, GF. The location was the small conference room on the 14th floor. The one without security cameras. The 8th screenshot came from the company's health management portal. It showed changes to Peggy's medication. 3 weeks before her death, Dr. Finch discontinued the anticoagulant prescribed by her cardiologist. He replaced it with another medication whose name I did not recognize. I photographed the record with my phone and sent the name to Frank. He entered it into a medical database. While he searched, I examined the 9th and 10th screenshots. They were internal email chains. In both, Renee approved decisions that should have required authorization from Peggy's cardiologist. One email directed the executive health coordinator not to contact Peggy's regular physician because Dr. Finch had assumed complete oversight. The second instructed the pharmacy administrator to treat all medication changes as confidential executive directives. "Why would a daughter-in-law approve medical decisions?" I asked. Sandra shook her head. "She should not have." "Did Peggy know?" "I do not know." Frank turned his laptop toward us. The replacement medication carried a prominent safety warning. It was associated with a significantly elevated risk of hemorrhagic stroke in patients with prior arterial complications. Peggy had suffered a mild arterial event 14 months before she died. The information was clearly documented in her medical file. Any physician reviewing that file would have seen it. Dr. Finch had signed a statement confirming that he reviewed the entire history. He had known. My hands remained flat on the table. I concentrated on keeping them still. After 30 years of interviews, I understood the effect of visible emotion on a frightened witness. Sandra needed to believe I was capable of carrying what she had brought. Inside, I felt as though a steel cable had been drawn through my chest and tightened. The 11th screenshot was the email. It had been sent from Renee's corporate account to an external address connected to Pacific Health Consulting Partners. The recipient was Dr. Gerald Finch. The date was September 18, 19 days before Peggy's death. The message contained 4 short lines. "Gerald, the board presentation has been moved forward. Margaret is asking more questions than expected about the third quarter disbursements. The timeline needs to move faster. We are running out of room." I read it once. Then again. Then a third time. Each reading made the meaning less ambiguous. They had been discussing more than money. Peggy was asking questions. A board presentation was approaching. Their time was narrowing. Dr. Finch changed her medication. 19 days later, she suffered a fatal hemorrhagic stroke. The evidence did not yet prove murder. I knew that. Correlation was not causation. A dangerous prescription could be negligence. An ambiguous email could be explained. Payments could be called consulting fees. Any one item standing alone might survive legal scrutiny. Together, they formed the outline of something deliberate. Sandra watched my face. "Mr. Stafford, I should have gone to the police. You did not know what you had." I knew something was wrong. Suspicion is not the same as understanding. I was afraid they would destroy my family. They used that fear against you. I accepted the money. You accepted severance after being threatened with financial ruin. Does that make me part of it? No. I said the word firmly. You preserved evidence. You contacted me. And now you are telling the truth. That is what matters. Tears moved down both sides of her face. She did not wipe them away. "Mrs. Stafford told me you were good at this." My throat tightened. She gave me more credit than I deserved. "No." Sandra shook her head. "She said that if everything went wrong, you would know what to do." I looked down at the phone. Peggy had spent the final months of her life placing pieces of evidence in the hands of people she trusted. A backup drive with me. Screenshots with Sandra. Whatever was inside the clock. She had built a case without allowing any single person to hold enough information to expose the entire plan. It was compartmentalization. A method we had used in federal investigations to protect witnesses and prevent leaks. She had learned more from my career than I realized. Or perhaps she had always possessed the same instincts. Frank closed the medical database. "We need to call Briggs." Sandra looked between us. "Who is Briggs?" "Thomas Briggs," I said. "Assistant Special Agent in charge of the FBI's Los Angeles Financial Crimes Unit." Her expression tightened. "The FBI?" "Yes. I do not want my name in the news." "It does not need to be." "Can they protect me?" "If they open an investigation and accept you as a cooperating witness, they can take steps to protect your identity and document any attempt to intimidate you." "What happens to the non-disclosure agreement?" "It becomes irrelevant to your cooperation." She looked at the old phone. "I think Mrs. Stafford expected me to do this." "I believe she hoped you would." Sandra wiped her face with a napkin. "All right." The word was quiet, but it carried more courage than many speeches I had heard in federal court. "All right," she repeated. "Call him." Frank and I drove back toward the motel with the windows open. The October air carried the dry clarity that follows the Santa Ana winds. The San Gabriel Mountains appeared unusually sharp against the sky. For the first 10 minutes, neither of us spoke. Frank drove with his left hand resting high on the wheel and his right elbow against the door. I watched the storefronts along Valley Boulevard give way to warehouses, overpasses, and the industrial corridor leading toward downtown. I thought of Peggy entering Stafford Capital each morning. She would have greeted the receptionist by name. She would have asked about someone's child or remembered an employee's anniversary. Then she would have entered meetings with Douglas and Renee while quietly collecting evidence that they were stealing from her. She had reviewed budgets, answered calls, and discussed future investments while knowing that people across the table might be arranging her destruction. The courage of that was extraordinary. The loneliness of it was unbearable. My throat tightened until I had to turn toward the window. "You all right?" Frank asked. "No." He nodded. "Keep driving," I said. Back at the motel, Frank secured the wireless network while I transferred copies of Sandra's screenshots onto an encrypted drive. We created a written log documenting the time, location, device, and method used to copy each file. Chain of custody mattered. A defense attorney could challenge evidence for years based on one careless transfer. We had no intention of giving Warren Lyle that opportunity. When the package was organized, I called Thomas Briggs. He answered before the second ring. "Gene Stafford." His voice was exactly as I remembered it. Low, unhurried, and still carrying traces of Chicago despite 2 decades in Los Angeles. "I was wondering when you would call. You saw the news?" "I saw it." "You believe it?" "I believe television producers enjoy a simple story. I also believe nothing involving $60 million is simple." I almost smiled. "Thomas, I need a secure line." The quality of his silence changed. A door closed between the personal conversation and the professional one. "Give me 4 minutes." He disconnected. 3 minutes later, my phone rang through an encrypted federal channel. I placed him on speaker so Frank could hear. "Start at the beginning," Briggs said. I described the warning Peggy gave me at dinner. I explained the power of attorney, the transfer, the court order, and the attempt to remove me from the house. Then Frank walked him through the 6 shell corporations, the $18.4 million, the Panama intermediaries, the Swiss accounts, and the Cayman Trust naming Douglas and Renee's beneficiaries. I told him about Renee's connection to the Georgia securities fraud investigation. Then we described Sandra Kowalski. The Pacific Health payments. Dr. Finch. The medication change. The safety warning. The email. When we finished, Briggs remained silent for several seconds. He was not shocked. Men like Thomas Briggs do not remain in federal financial crimes long enough to be shocked by greed. He was organizing the facts into prosecutable categories. Potential wire fraud, he said. Money laundering. Conspiracy. Obstruction. Possible witness intimidation. Depending on the medical evidence, there may also be a criminal act connected to Mrs. Stafford's death. My hand tightened around the phone. "What do you need?" "The email is important. The prescription history is important. But neither proves causation." "I understand. A forensic pharmacologist will need to evaluate whether the medication materially contributed to the stroke. We will need Mrs. Stafford's complete medical records and an independent review." "How long?" "Days for a preliminary opinion. Longer for testimony that survives cross-examination." "And the money?" "The Cayman Trust is a problem." "Because of the jurisdiction?" "Yes. We can begin the international process, but formal access may require subpoenas, treaty requests, and cooperation from multiple institutions. We have the beneficiary document." "You have a document produced through private forensic software. It gives us direction, but the prosecution will need authenticated banking records." Frank said, "The transfer chain from Stafford Capital to the shells is clean." "I agree. But I need something stronger than money reaching an offshore structure associated with them." "What exactly?" Briggs answered without hesitation. "I need an overt act. A personal transaction? A transfer they personally authorize or attempt to control. Something that places the proceeds directly in their hands or demonstrates their intention to seize the remaining assets. The 60 million. Yes. The court froze it. For now. What do they want you to do next? I thought of Douglas's expression in my living room. They want me to surrender the transfer. Formally? They have not presented the final agreement yet. When will they? The Stafford Capital annual shareholder meeting is in 4 days. The line went quiet. Frank looked at me. Briggs spoke again. Are you expected to attend? Douglas contacted me before the funeral about signing estate and voting documents at the meeting. I believe they still expect me to cooperate. Why would they believe that after obtaining the court order? Because they froze every account I own, removed me from my home, and publicly accused me of abusing my wife. They are trying to break you. Yes. And they believe it worked. They will if I allow them to. Briggs understood immediately. You want them to attempt the transfer in front of the board. A room full of witnesses. A documented demand. And an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Briggs released a slow breath. That could give us probable cause for warrants. And if they present documents granting them control over the 60 million? It could establish intent to obtain proceeds derived from the broader scheme. What about recording the conversation? California generally requires consent from all parties for confidential communications. Do not record anything on your own. I know the law. I know you know it. Grief makes experienced people careless. I accepted the correction. What can you authorize? If we open a formal investigation and you participate as a cooperating witness, we may be able to arrange lawful monitoring under federal protocols. I need approval. How soon? Send me everything tonight. Everything? The financial records, shell company documents, trust information, Georgia file, Sandra's screenshots, medical records, and the timeline. Do not omit anything because you think it is unimportant. We will assemble it. I also need Sandra's contact information. She is willing to cooperate. Make certain she understands that contact from my office will be confidential. Once she gives a formal statement, any attempt to intimidate or retaliate against her must be reported immediately. She will be relieved. Jean, one more thing. His voice became quieter. What? Do not approach Douglas, Renee, Lyle, or Finch directly. I had not planned to. You planned to 30 years ago whenever someone made you angry. I have matured. Frank made a doubtful sound. Briggs ignored him. If they realize how much evidence exists, they will move the remaining assets, pressure Sandra, and destroy anything still inside Stafford Capital. Understood. You need to behave like a man who has lost. I looked around the motel room. The stained ceiling. The rattling air conditioner. The half-empty package of crackers. That should not require much acting. I am serious. So am I. Briggs was silent. Then he asked the question no investigator asks unless the personal history matters. Are you all right? Not the case, he added. You. I looked toward the antique clock. I will be. When? When this is finished. 4 days, he said. Hold yourself together for 4 more days. I will. Send the package. The line disconnected. Frank and I spent the next 3 hours assembling the evidence. We created 7 folders. The first contained a master chronology beginning with Renee's marriage to Douglas and ending with the court order freezing my accounts. The second contained the 6 consulting contracts, payment authorizations, and corporate registry records. The third traced the funds through Panama, Switzerland, and the Cayman Trust. The fourth documented Renee's prior connection to the Georgia investigation. The fifth contained Sandra's screenshots and our chain of custody notes. The sixth included Dr. Finch's professional history, the medication warning, and the known timeline of Peggy's treatment. The seventh documented the public campaign against me, including Douglas's video, the news coverage, and messages repeating language that appeared to originate with Warren Lyle. We added a table of contents. Every document received a number. Every date was cross-referenced. Every bank account and corporate entity was placed in a diagram showing its relationship to the others. We had worked together this way for 19 years. The rhythm returned almost immediately. Frank called it muscle memory of the mind. One of us reviewed the numbers while the other tested the narrative. One asked what a defense attorney would challenge. The other searched for the answer. By 7:45 that evening, the package was ready. I transmitted it through the encrypted federal portal Briggs provided. At 8:12, a message appeared. Package received. Verification begins tonight. Stand by. I placed the phone on the nightstand. The motel room had grown dark around us. Only the laptop screen and the orange parking lot lights illuminated the walls. Frank began packing his equipment. You should sleep. I doubt I can. Lie down anyway. Your body does not require your permission to rest. I have spent 65 years proving otherwise. And the results are visible. He placed the drives inside his canvas bag. At the door, he stopped. The expression on his face was familiar. I had seen it at the end of major investigations, after months of surveillance and thousands of reviewed transactions. It was not triumph. Frank had never celebrated another person's ruin. It was something quieter. The expression of a man who had completed the necessary work and accepted the cost. Peggy chose well, he said. What do you mean? Leaving this to you. The pain moved through my chest so suddenly that I could not answer. I looked away. Good night, Frank. He nodded once. I will call in the morning. Then he left. The room felt different after the door closed. Not quieter. Emptier. A television murmured behind the wall. A car crossed the parking lot. Somewhere in the city, a siren rose and faded. I sat at the desk and thought about Peggy's warning. Within 48 hours, you will understand. She had been right. I understood why she feared Douglas. I understood why she ordered me to transfer the money. I understood why Renee wanted the clock. I understood that the probate dispute was only a weapon designed to hide something much larger. And I understood that my wife had spent her final months constructing a case against the people closest to her. What I did not yet understand was how much evidence she had hidden inside the antique clock. It rested on the desk beneath the yellow lamp. The brass casing reflected a thin line of light. The faint seam along the back panel was clearly visible now. I reached toward it. Then I stopped. Frank had been right. The clock was evidence. Opening it carelessly could damage whatever Peggy had concealed. I should have waited until morning. I should have called Frank. I should have followed the same procedures I had respected throughout my career. But I was no longer only an investigator. I was a husband sitting alone in a motel room with the last object his wife had placed in his hands. For 31 years, Peggy and I had shared everything that mattered. Now she had left me one final secret. And outside that room, my son and his wife were preparing to take the company, the money, my home, and the truth about her death. 4 days remained. 4 days to convince Douglas and Renee that they had broken me. 4 days for Briggs to verify the evidence. 4 days to discover whether Peggy's last plan could survive without her. I placed both hands around the clock. The metal was cool. I turned it over. My thumbnail found the narrow seam. For one moment, I could almost hear Peggy's voice. Patient. Steady. Telling me not to use force. Telling me to find where the mechanism gave way. I pressed carefully against the back panel. Something inside the clock shifted. The panel moved less than the width of a fingernail. And in that instant, I knew with absolute certainty that the clock contained more than an old mechanical movement. Peggy had hidden something inside it. Something small. Something important. And judging by Renee's reaction at the house and the search of my motel room, something dangerous enough to frighten everyone who had betrayed us. I withdrew my hand. Not yet. I had waited this long. I could wait until I had the proper equipment, a secure copy system, and a witness beside me. I wrapped the clock in a clean motel towel and placed it inside the small safe beneath the television. Then I moved a chair against the door, turned off the light, and lay down on the bed. Sleep did not come. I listened to the air conditioner rattle. I listened to footsteps pass outside. And I thought about the woman who had trusted me to finish what she began. By morning, the FBI would be reviewing our evidence. Sandra Kowalski would be preparing to give her statement. Dr. Gerald Finch would still believe no one had connected him to the medication change. Warren Lyle would still believe his court order had silenced me. Douglas would still believe his public accusations had destroyed my credibility. And Renee would still believe the clock was somewhere beyond her reach. They all believed I was alone. They all believed I was defeated. They all believed the old man they had forced into a cheap motel had nothing left. They were wrong. I still had Frank. I still had Sandra. I still had 30 years of experience following money that did not want to be found. And locked inside a motel safe, I had the final message Margaret Stafford had left behind. The message that would change the entire investigation. The message that would force me to confront not only what Renee had done, but what my own son had known. 4 days remained. And before those 4 days were over, every person who had used Peggy's death as an opportunity would be required to sit in the same room and face the evidence she had spent her final months preserving. But first, I had to open the clock. The back panel of the antique clock released with a sound so faint that I almost imagined it. I placed the clock beneath the motel desk lamp and carefully lifted the brass panel away from the casing. Inside was a shallow compartment. It had been carved so precisely into the wooden lining that no one would have discovered it without knowing exactly where to look. Resting inside the compartment was a small memory card. The kind used in cameras and recording devices. Peggy had wrapped it in a square of clear plastic and secured it with a narrow strip of tape that appeared to have been cut with manicure scissors. My hands began to shake. I was conscious of the movement, but I made no effort to stop it. During 30 years of federal investigations, I had handled evidence connected to billion-dollar frauds, criminal organizations, and men capable of destroying hundreds of lives without losing a moment of sleep. My hands had remained steady through all of it. But professional discipline has limits. Opening the final gift left by the woman you loved for 31 years is beyond those limits. I peeled away the tape. I unfolded the plastic. Then I carried the memory card to the laptop and inserted it into the reader Frank had left behind. A storage window opened on the screen. There were 3 items. They were labeled simply 1, 2, 3. No descriptions. No names. No instructions. Just 3 numbered files waiting for me in a $47 motel room near Union Station. I opened the first. It was an audio recording. 47 minutes and 22 seconds long. According to the timestamp, it had been created on September 17, exactly 3 weeks before Peggy died. The location information embedded in the file showed that the recording had been made on the 14th floor of the Stafford Capitol building in Century City. I placed Frank's earbuds in my ears. Then I pressed play. Peggy's voice filled my head. The sound of it struck me so suddenly that my entire body reacted. For one impossible second, she was alive again. Not in a photograph. Not in a memory. Not as an image lying motionless in a hospital bed. She was speaking. Her voice was calm, precise, and slightly warmer than the tone she used during formal business meetings. She had possessed a rare ability to make the person in front of her feel as though no one else in the world required her attention. That quality was present in the recording. She was speaking to Douglas. I listened to all 47 minutes. There are parts of that conversation I will never repeat. Some words belong only to a mother and her son, even when the son has betrayed her. The recording contained moments of anger, disappointment, denial, and a grief so personal that using it for public entertainment would have felt like another theft from Peggy. But the essential facts were unmistakable. Douglas had known. He may not have understood the full international structure Renee had created. He may not have known every shell corporation, every offshore account, or every step used to conceal the stolen money. But he knew enough. He knew the consulting companies did not perform legitimate work. He knew the payments were deliberately kept beneath Stafford Capital's internal review threshold. He knew Renee was controlling the vendor relationships. And he knew his own digital signature appeared on every authorization. At one point, Douglas asked whether Peggy planned to restructure the company's capital allocation before the end of the fiscal year. His voice carried the sound of a man attempting to convince himself that the problem was technical. Temporary. Correctable. Something that could be settled quietly without forcing him to admit what he had done. Peggy did not argue with him. She allowed him to finish. Then she asked a simple question. Douglas, when did you first realize those companies had no employees? There was a long silence. He did not answer directly. That silence answered for him. Later, he claimed Renee had assured him that the consultants were legitimate intermediaries used for international regulatory work. Peggy asked why legitimate intermediaries required payments to 6 separate companies registered through the same Las Vegas mailbox. Again, he avoided the question. He spoke about loyalty, marriage, the pressure he had been under. He said Renee believed Peggy never trusted him with real authority. He accused his mother of treating him like a child while expecting him to perform like an executive. Somewhere along the way, he had turned resentment into permission. Permission to ignore what he knew. Permission to sign what should never have been signed. Permission to accept money he had not earned. And eventually, permission to help destroy the woman who gave him everything. Peggy's voice remained controlled throughout the conversation. That made it more painful. She did not scream at him. She did not insult him. She did not threaten him. She simply placed each fact in front of him and waited. By the end of the recording, Douglas was no longer denying that the payments were fraudulent. He was asking what his mother intended to do about them. Peggy told him she had not decided. That was the only lie I heard her tell. She had already decided. She was building the case. I closed the recording and opened the second item. It was not a single file. It was a folder containing 312 documents. Payment authorizations. Internal ledgers. Vendor agreements. Board minutes. Email chains. Corporate registration records. Copies of international wire instructions. Notes documenting conversations. Screenshots of account activity. Every file was labeled by date and organized into subfolders. Peggy had spent 6 months quietly preserving the evidence. She had done it after business hours, when the Stafford Capital offices had emptied and the lights of Century City were reflected in the building's glass walls. I imagined her sitting alone at her desk while cleaning crews moved through the hallways. Downloading records. Comparing signatures. Photographing documents. Building timelines. Checking every number twice. Then returning home to me and behaving as though the day had been ordinary. I remembered evenings when she appeared distracted at dinner. Nights when she said the board had been difficult. Weekends when she went into the office for what she called unfinished quarterly work. I had believed her because Peggy rarely brought company problems home. Now I understood that she had been carrying the greatest problem of her life alone. She had not excluded me because she doubted my loyalty. She had excluded me because she trusted my nature too well. Had I known, I would have acted. Immediately. Publicly. And too soon. She protected the case by keeping me outside it until the evidence could survive without her. My throat tightened until swallowing became difficult. I returned to the main folder and opened the third item. It was a video. 40 seconds long. The image showed Peggy seated at the desk in her home office. The camera had been positioned beside the lamp. A framed photograph from our anniversary trip to Carmel was partly visible in the lower corner. Peggy wore the gray cardigan she often wore on Sunday mornings. Her hair was down. She looked tired. But she also looked peaceful in the particular way people sometimes look after making a painful decision and finally accepting its cost. She stared into the camera for 1 full second before speaking. During that second, I saw everything she had been hiding from me. The fear. The exhaustion. The disappointment in Douglas. The burden of knowing that the people closest to her were stealing from the company she had spent her life building. And beneath all of that, the love that made her carry the burden alone. Then she spoke. "Jean, if you are watching this, it means I am no longer there." She paused. "I am sorry. I am so deeply sorry that I could not tell you sooner." Her eyes lowered briefly. Then she looked back at the camera. "I need you to understand why I kept this from you. You have always faced problems directly. It is one of the things I love most about you, but this time, direct action would have destroyed everything." She drew a careful breath. "If I had told you that Douglas was involved, you would have confronted him that same day. He would have warned Renee. She would have moved the remaining money and destroyed the records before we could document where it went." Peggy leaned slightly closer. "I needed them to believe they were winning. I needed them to become confident enough to make one final move." She looked tired, but her voice remained steady. "And I needed you to discover the evidence yourself. Evidence collected independently by a retired federal investigator will carry more weight than documents handed to him by a frightened wife involved in a family dispute." A faint shadow of a smile touched the corner of her mouth. "I know that sounds like something you would say." Despite everything, a broken laugh escaped me. She continued. The financial records are on this card. The trail reaches the Cayman Islands. Frank will understand the structure. Her almost smile returned. I included Frank's name because I knew you would call him. You always call Frank when something is serious. That was when the walls I had built around my grief finally collapsed. Peggy looked directly into the camera. I trust you, Jean. I have always trusted you. Her voice softened. Finish this properly. Do not rush. Do not allow your anger to damage the case. Then she said the words that hurt more than anything else. And when it is finished, please live. She pressed her lips together. Do not turn the rest of your life into a monument to me. Make it yours. Eat real meals. Go outside. Let people help you, even when you would rather pretend you do not need them. Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. I love you. I will always have loved you. That is not the kind of thing that ends simply because one person is no longer there to say it. The video stopped. The screen went dark. I sat at the motel desk with the empty clock casing in my hands. And I cried. Not the controlled tears I had allowed myself in the hospital. Not the silent grief I managed during the funeral. Not the careful emotion of a widower trying to remain composed while strangers offered condolences. This grief came from somewhere deeper. From the place where 31 years of marriage actually lives when it is no longer expressed through conversation, shared meals, familiar arguments, and the sound of another person moving through the house. It rose through me with the force of an earthquake shaking an old building from its foundation. I folded forward over the desk. I cried until my throat hurt. Until breathing became difficult. Until there was nothing left to hold back and no one in the room for whom I needed to remain strong. When it ended, I sat in a different kind of silence. The room had not changed. The ceiling was still stained. The air conditioner still rattled. Traffic continued moving outside. But something inside me had been cleared. The way the air becomes cleaner after a storm passes through. Peggy had not left me a burden. She had left me her trust. The most complete and expensive kind of trust one human being can place in another. The kind that says, I know exactly who you are. I know your strengths. I know your weaknesses. I know what you will do when you are angry. And I am placing the hardest thing I possess into your hands because I believe you will not drop it. I set the clock gently on the desk. Then I straightened my back. I opened a blank document on the laptop and began listing everything that had to happen during the next 4 days. Not emotionally. Not impulsively. In order. Evidence preservation. Legal verification. Federal authentication. Asset tracing. Witness protection. The shareholder meeting. The final transaction. By sunrise, I had a plan. I called Frank at 7 in the morning. He answered before the second ring. Either he had not slept, or he had slept the way we both used to during long investigations, lightly, partially, with one ear open for the telephone. I found it, I said. The clock. Yes. What was inside? Everything. Frank was silent for 3 seconds. Then his voice softened. How are you doing? I am functional. That is not what I asked. It is the only answer I have. He accepted that. What did she leave? An audio recording with Douglas. 312 documents. A video explaining what she did and why. Frank breathed slowly. I'm sorry, Jean. I need you to search Peggy's personal financial records. For what? Payments to outside legal counsel during the last 8 months. Anything that did not go through Stafford Capital or our joint household accounts. You think she hired an independent attorney? I know she did. How? She constructed a complete evidentiary package. She would not leave the estate vulnerable to the company attorneys. Especially not if she suspected Warren Lyle was involved. I'll call you back. He returned the call 40 minutes later. I found one payment. To whom? Clara Hutchins. Hutchins Estate Law in Old Pasadena. $4,200 from a personal checking account Peggy maintained separately. When? 6 weeks before she died. I'll meet you there. Clara Hutchins practiced law from an office on Colorado Boulevard. The building had housed the same firm for 3 decades. Its reception area contained dark wood paneling, framed photographs of the San Gabriel Mountains, and the quiet confidence of a place that did not need modern furniture to prove its importance. Clara was 58. Her silver hair was cut short, and her reading glasses hung from a beaded chain around her neck. She carried herself with the calm directness of a woman who had spent 30 years guiding families through death, inheritance, betrayal, and the complicated ways grief can become litigation. She stood when Frank and I entered. "Mr. Stafford," she said. "I have been expecting you." Her statement stopped me. "Peggy told you I would come?" "She said you would come when you were ready." Claire offered her hand. Her grip was firm. "She told me quite a bit about you. I hope some of it was favorable." A small smile appeared. "She said you were the most methodical person she had ever known." That may not have been a compliment. She intended it as one. Clara gestured toward the chairs across from her desk. "She said you never left anything half-finished and hoped the remaining half would solve itself." That sounded exactly like Peggy. Clara's expression changed slightly. "She said your determination could be maddening." That also sounds like her. "And she said it was one of the reasons she loved you." I lowered myself into the chair. For a moment, I did not trust my voice. Frank sat beside me without speaking. When I could continue, I asked the question that brought us there. "The will?" Clara opened the upper drawer of her desk and removed a blue legal folder. She placed it between us. "Margaret came to me alone. She was very specific that no one connected to Stafford Capital should know she had retained independent counsel." "Did she mention Renee?" "Yes." "Douglas?" "Yes." "Warren Lyle?" Clara's eyes sharpened. "Especially Mr. Lyle." She opened the folder. "This document was executed 6 weeks before Margaret's death. It replaces every previous will and estate instrument." She turned the pages toward me. "The Pasadena property, her investment accounts, personal assets, and controlling interest in Stafford Capital Group passed to you, Eugene Stafford, as sole beneficiary." I read the document carefully. Then I read it again. The language was precise. The signatures were properly witnessed. The notarization was complete. The witnesses had no connection to Stafford Capital, our family, or Clara's firm beyond the signing itself. Peggy had eliminated every predictable basis for challenge. Then I reached page 3. Paragraph 7. Clara placed one finger beside it. "Read that section carefully. The clause stated that any beneficiary proven to have participated in financial fraud, undue influence, breach of fiduciary duty, or intentional harm against Margaret Stafford or her estate would be treated as having died before her. That beneficiary would receive nothing. No voting interest. No property. No trust distribution. No right to challenge the remaining estate plan beyond what California law absolutely required." Douglas had not merely been removed from the will. His fraud had been anticipated. Peggy had built the legal structure so that proving his crimes would automatically destroy his claim to the estate. Frank read over my shoulder. "She was thorough. She was always thorough." Clara closed the folder halfway. "There is another item." She returned to the drawer and removed a sealed cream-colored envelope. My name was written across the front in Peggy's handwriting. The first letter of Jean had been pressed more deeply into the paper, the way her pen always moved when she wanted to form something precisely. "She left this for you," Clara said. "When am I supposed to open it?" "After you understood the will." I took the envelope in both hands. "Did she tell you what it says?" "No." "Did she seem frightened?" Clara considered her answer. "She seemed determined." "That was not my question." "No," Clara said gently. "It was not." She folded her hands. "Yes. She was frightened. But not for herself." "For whom?" "You. The company. Her employees. And, despite everything, Douglas." I looked at the envelope. "Thank you for protecting this." She asked me to. It was not difficult. For Clara, perhaps it had not been. For Peggy, arranging it must have required accepting that she might not survive long enough to see whether the plan worked. I slipped the envelope into the inside pocket of my jacket, beside the place where I had carried the clock. Something settled inside me. Not peace. Not yet. But structure. Peggy had left nothing to chance. Frank and I returned to the motel and spent the afternoon rebuilding the evidence package around the material from the memory card. We worked as we had during our federal careers. Methodically. Without rushing. Impatience destroys good evidence faster than almost anything else. Frank organized the financial records. I created the narrative timeline. Every transaction was connected to an authorization. Every authorization was connected to a person. Every company was connected to an address, registered agent, bank account, or international transfer. Peggy's audio recording was indexed by time. The 312 documents were numbered and cross-referenced. The Cayman Trust appeared at the end of the financial chain. The new will and forfeiture clause formed a separate legal section. By 4 in the afternoon, we had a package describing 41 months of criminal activity across 4 jurisdictions. 7 folders. 1 master index. A story clear enough for investigators, prosecutors, a judge, and eventually 12 jurors to understand. I called Thomas Briggs at 4:15. I have additional evidence. How significant? It changes the entire scope. Go ahead. My wife spent 6 months building the case herself. She left 312 internal documents, a 47-minute recording of Douglas acknowledging that he knew the consulting vendors were fraudulent, and an independently executed will containing a forfeiture clause. Briggs said nothing. I continued. The will strips Douglas of inheritance rights upon proof that he participated in fraud or breached his fiduciary duty. It was signed 6 weeks before Peggy died by independent witnesses through an attorney with no connection to Stafford Capital. The silence lasted several seconds. Then Briggs spoke quietly. Your wife was extraordinary. Yes. It was the easiest truth I had spoken all week. She was. I transmitted the new package through the encrypted federal portal. Briggs called back 20 minutes later. The audio is what we needed. You listened to it already? I reviewed the index sections. His voice carried the restrained energy of an investigator who had just found the load-bearing evidence in a complicated case. Douglas's acknowledgement, combined with his digital signatures, establishes knowing participation. It closes the gap between negligence and criminal intent. Can you obtain warrants? I can present this to a federal judge tomorrow morning. Wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. There is one condition. Federal investigations generally do not operate according to conditions imposed by cooperating witnesses. Listen first. I'm listening. The arrests happen at the shareholder meeting. Briggs was silent. I explained. Peggy built the case to protect the company. The board trusted Renee and allowed her to take control of the financial structure. They deserve to see the evidence before they learn about the arrests from a television report. You want witnesses. I want accountability. Those are not always the same thing. This time, they can be. The meeting is in 3 days? Yes. That gives us time to verify the records, secure warrants, and coordinate arrests for Douglas, Renee, and Finch. And Lyle? We are still evaluating his role. He threatened Sandra with financial ruin to keep her quiet. If Sandra confirms that under oath, we will investigate obstruction and witness intimidation. I looked toward Frank. He nodded. Briggs continued. To make this work, Douglas and Renee must believe you are coming to surrender. They will. How? I'm going to call my son and tell him we won. Frank raised one eyebrow. Briggs said, Can you make him believe you? I spent 30 years interviewing people who lied for a living. That does not answer the question. Yes. I can make him believe me. The moment you enter that meeting, you will be participating in a federal operation. My agents will already be inside the building. Understood. You will not improvise. I rarely improvise. Frank looked at me as though I had insulted mathematics itself. Briggs apparently knew better as well. Hold the line, Gene. 3 more days. That evening, I called Douglas. He answered on the 3rd ring. Long enough to show that he had seen my name and considered whether speaking to me was strategically useful. Dad? His voice was neutral. Controlled. Douglas. I allowed my own voice to sound exhausted. That part required little acting. I've been thinking about what you said. What did I say? That I'm too old for this fight. He did not respond immediately. I continued. You were right. The silence on the other end became attentive. I buried your mother last week. I'm living in a motel near Union Station. My accounts are frozen. People I have known for decades think I exploited my wife. I allowed my breathing to become uneven. I don't have the strength for a legal battle that lasts years. Dad? I want it over. I let my voice break slightly. Then I waited. 3 seconds passed. Inside those seconds, I heard Douglas exhale. A long, quiet release of tension. He had been waiting for this call. More importantly, someone was almost certainly waiting beside him. "I'm glad you called," he said. Warmth entered his voice immediately. Too immediately. The rehearsed warmth of a man who had been told what to say when a defeated father finally asked for mercy. "We never wanted this to become painful. You removed me from my home. The attorneys believed it was necessary to protect the estate. You froze my retirement account. That can be reversed. You called me a predator in front of the entire country. I was grieving." The words sounded prepared. I pressed my hand against my chest and forced myself to remain focused. "What do you want me to sign?" "We should discuss that in person. Tomorrow." Another pause. Then Renee's voice appeared faintly in the background. Douglas covered the phone, but not completely. I could not distinguish every word. I heard enough. "Restaurant. Lake Avenue. Afternoon." He returned. "Can you meet us tomorrow at 2? "Yes. We can work out something fair." "I don't want fair." I lowered my voice. "I want peace." "That's what we want, too." No, it was not. But I let him believe I accepted the lie. The restaurant Renee selected was on Lake Avenue in Pasadena. Quiet. Expensive enough to discourage interruptions. Private enough for legal documents. I arrived unshaven. I wore the same jacket I had worn for 2 days. My shoulders remained slightly forward, and I allowed exhaustion to flatten my expression. I wanted them to see a 65-year-old widower who had reached the end of his strength. Douglas was already seated. Renee sat beside him. Warren Lyle sat across from them with his briefcase positioned near his right leg. Renee had brought the settlement agreement. Of course she had. It appeared on the table before my coffee arrived. "It's straightforward," she said. Her voice was gentle. Not truly gentle. Gentle in the way a polished knife may feel smooth before it cuts. "You withdraw any claim to the Callaway Reserve account. You resign all voting and administrative authority connected to Stafford Capital. You acknowledge that the transfer occurred while Margaret was medically impaired. That would be admitting I exploited her. It would prevent years of litigation. And what happens to my accounts? The freeze is removed. My house. You receive a reasonable period to collect your personal belongings. The house was not included. They intended to keep it." Renee continued. "You walk away with your retirement funds and no further legal exposure. No scandal?" I asked. She inclined her head. "We can release a statement saying the matter was resolved privately." "You created the scandal." Douglas reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. His palm was warm. "Mom would have wanted you to have peace." The touch nearly broke me. That hand had once been small enough to close around one of my fingers. I had held it while teaching him to cross a street. While walking him into his first day of school. While sitting beside him in the emergency room after a baseball injury. Now the same hand covered mine while he tried to convince me to surrender his mother's estate. I kept my eyes lowered. I breathed slowly. "I want to sign at the shareholder meeting." Renee's attention sharpened. "Why? In front of the board. That is unnecessary. I need witnesses." My voice sounded small. "I need people to see that I cooperated. So no one can later claim I changed my mind or misunderstood the agreement." I allowed my eyes to become wet. "That way it ends in front of everyone." Renee looked at Douglas. Their exchange lasted less than a second. But I saw the calculation. A public surrender would do more than obtain my signature. It would establish Renee's control before the entire executive board. It would humiliate me in the room where Peggy had built her authority. That appealed to her. "That is reasonable," Renee said. "Day after tomorrow?" 6 o'clock, Warren answered. He slid a preliminary acknowledgement toward me. "This simply confirms your intention to complete the settlement at the meeting." I read it carefully. The document was not the binding waiver. It acknowledged only that negotiations were taking place. A fact that would matter later. I initialed the bottom. Then I returned the pen. Renee smiled softly. "You are making the right decision." I looked at my coffee. "I hope so." They left 20 minutes later. I remained seated until their car disappeared. Then I reached into my jacket and pressed the button on the recording device provided by Briggs's office. Unlike a private telephone recording, the device had been deployed under authorized federal investigative procedures. Every sentence had been captured legally. I transmitted the file. 4 minutes later, Briggs replied. "Clean audio. Every word. We're ready." 2 days remained. That night, the motel room seemed smaller than ever. I ordered a sandwich from a deli 2 blocks away. I ate half while reviewing the evidence sequence. Everything was prepared. Briggs's agents would enter the Stafford Capitol building before 5:30. 2 would wait in the lobby. 2 near the stairwell on the 18th floor. Others would cover the parking structure and service exits. Sandra would arrive shortly before 6. Clara would bring the original will in a sealed legal envelope. Frank would operate the presentation. The board would receive the evidence. And when Renee or Douglas attempted to formalize control of the estate, Briggs would move. There was nothing more to do. Nothing except wait. My eyes moved toward the envelope Clara had given me. Peggy's handwriting remained visible across the front. I had carried it for 2 days. I had read the will. I understood why she required that order. Yet I had not opened the letter. Some things cannot be approached according to the schedule another person leaves behind. I had needed time. That night, I was ready. I slid my thumb beneath the seal. The letter contained 2 pages written on Peggy's personal stationery. Cream-colored paper. A small embossed letter in the upper corner. Her handwriting was slightly uneven in places, which told me she had written it during the evening, when her hands were sometimes less steady. The date was September 21st. 16 days before her death. I began reading. "My dear Jean. By the time you receive this, you will already have completed most of the difficult work. That is what you do. You finish things. You do not leave half of a problem unattended and hope it becomes embarrassed enough to solve itself. This quality has occasionally driven me completely mad. It is also one of the reasons I have loved you for 31 years. I stopped. My hands pressed against the desk. The tightness in my chest became unbearable for several seconds. I breathed until it became merely painful. Then I continued. I should have told you more often what your presence gave me. You made me feel safe. Not because you protected me from the world. You knew better than to try, and I never needed rescuing. You made me feel safe because you were there. Consistently. Reliably. Without drama. Without conditions. 31 years of someone simply being there may sound ordinary to people who have never had it. It is not ordinary. It is the largest gift I have ever received." The words blurred. I wiped my eyes and continued. "I am sorry about Douglas. I am sorry in ways for which I do not possess adequate language. Whatever he has done, he is still your son. I know that grief will live in a different place from the grief you feel for me. Do not allow either one to consume what remains of your life. Douglas made his choices. You made yours. That difference matters." The next paragraph referred to a foundation. "I have left notes in Clara's files concerning the money. I want you to use it for something that is not about money. You will understand when you read the plans." Then the letter became personal again. "Live well, Jean. Eat proper meals. Call Frank when things are difficult. Allow people to help you. Try not to correct everyone's grammar when they are doing their best. Go back to Carmel someday. You do not have to go immediately. But do not avoid it forever simply because I will not be sitting beside you." A tear fell onto the edge of the page. I moved it away before the ink could be damaged. The final lines read. "I have loved you since a conference room in San Francisco in 1994. I will not stop simply because I am no longer there to say it. Always. Peggy." I folded the pages along their original creases. Then I held the letter between both hands. Outside, Los Angeles continued its nighttime routine. A bus released its brakes. A siren moved somewhere along the freeway. A freight train departed Union Station, its horn sounding through the dark. During those weeks, I had come to think of the train as the sound of time continuing whether I approved or not. Frank called at 10:30. He had called every evening since the investigation began. "How are you?" She wrote me a letter. "Good letter?" "The best." My voice remained steady. I was proud of that. "Get some sleep," he said. Tomorrow we finish it. Yes. I looked at the evidence folders. Then at Peggy's letter. Tomorrow we finish it. For the first time since she died, I slept without dreaming of anything painful. October 14th arrived quietly. Important mornings often do. There was no announcement. No dramatic weather. Only the same pale California light that entered the motel window every morning. I was dressed before 5:30. Dark slacks. White shirt. Charcoal blazer. The same blazer I had worn during federal hearings, depositions, and courtroom testimony for 3 decades. I pressed it myself with the motel's travel iron. The iron kept sticking to the fabric, and the process required 3 times longer than it should have. I did not mind. I needed work for my hands. Frank arrived with coffee. Neither of us spoke during the first 10 minutes of the drive toward Century City. That was the proper amount of silence. Eventually, he updated me. Briggs's team is in place. How many? 2 agents in the lobby. 2 near the 18th floor stairwell. 2 in the parking structure. Additional personnel outside. Finch? A separate team is covering his clinic. Clara? She confirmed. Sandra? She'll wait in the lobby until I message her. I nodded. We merged onto the freeway. Los Angeles spread beneath the overpasses in a silver morning haze. The mountains rose beyond the city. The ocean was somewhere past the west side, invisible but present in the quality of the air. Peggy had loved Los Angeles from elevated roads. She said the city looked honest from above. Large. Untidy. Imperfect. Spreading in every direction without apologizing for itself. The Stafford Capitol building stood 40 stories high on Avenue of the Stars. Its glass exterior caught the morning sun and reflected it in cold white sheets. Frank parked in the guest structure. We entered the elevator beside a young associate carrying presentation folders. He avoided looking at me. By then, most people in the company had seen the allegations. That suited me. I wanted no conversations before the meeting. The 18th floor conference room was already prepared. A long oval table. High-backed leather chairs. A presentation screen at the far end. Pitchers of water. Printed settlement documents. The room carried the atmosphere of a place prepared for something important without knowing what that importance would become. A facilities employee adjusted the projector. Frank removed a compact wireless transmitter from his jacket. "We need this connected for Mr. Stafford's presentation." The employee connected it without asking questions. By 5:45, the 6 members of Stafford Capital's executive board had arrived. Men and women who had known Peggy for years. Some had been present when the company operated from a rented office. Others joined later, when Stafford Capital became a respected investment firm. All had trusted Renee with increasing authority. All had watched Douglas's public accusations. They greeted me with careful neutrality. The expression people use when they are uncertain whether an old friend has become a criminal. I shook each hand. I looked each person in the eye. Gerald Whitmore, the board chairman, held my hand longer than the others. He had worked beside Peggy from the company's earliest years. "I'm sorry, Gene," he said. "For what?" His eyes shifted. "Everything." I understood. At 5:58, Douglas entered. He wore a navy suit. His posture was confident. He smiled at the board members and laughed at something the chief financial officer said. He looked like a man arriving to complete a transaction he had already won. Renee followed 3 steps behind. She wore a structured black dress and carried a briefcase. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor at a steady, precise rhythm. She scanned the room immediately. Exits. People. Documents. Positions. Then her eyes found me at the far end of the table. I sat with my hands folded. My shoulders were slightly forward. My expression showed resignation. Renee's body relaxed by a fraction. It would have been invisible to almost anyone else. I saw it. She believed me defeated. Warren Lyle called the meeting to order at 6 o'clock. He placed the final settlement agreement in front of me. Then he placed his pen across the signature line. "Mr. Stafford," he said, "whenever you are ready." I looked down at the document. The blank line waited at the bottom of the page. I lifted the pen. Douglas leaned back. Renee watched my hand. I held the pen for 3 seconds. Then I placed it on the table. I raised my eyes. "Before I sign, I would like to show the board something." Lyle's smile weakened. "That is not part of today's agenda." "It is now." Douglas's jaw tightened. "Dad, we agreed." "You agreed that I could sign in front of witnesses." I looked toward Gerald Whitmore. "For the last 2 weeks, I have been living in a $47 motel room because my son obtained a court order accusing me of exploiting my wife." No one moved. "I used that time to complete the investigation Margaret Stafford began before she died." The silence changed. Not the courteous silence of a business meeting. A heavier silence. The kind that appears when intelligent people realize the situation is not what they believed. Frank connected the transmitter. The presentation screen illuminated. "Before I tell you what happened next, write the word justice in the comments so I know you stayed with me through the entire journey." Because what happened in that conference room did not simply expose a financial crime. It revealed what happens when greed convinces people that age, grief, and family loyalty are weaknesses they can exploit. The first slide showed Stafford Capital's official operating expense ledger. "You have all seen these numbers," I said. Renee presented them during quarterly reviews for 4 years. The figures showed rising expenses. International consulting. Regulatory services. Supply chain advisory costs. Executive planning. Professional language arranged to make unusual spending appear ordinary. I advanced the presentation. A second ledger appeared beside the first. This is the actual transaction history. The difference between the records was immediate. One board member inhaled sharply. Another leaned toward the screen. $18.4 million, I said. Removed from Stafford Capital over 41 months. The next slide displayed the 6 consulting companies. Crestline Advisory. Pacific Rim Consulting Group. Westlake Strategic Partners. Meridian Corporate Solutions. Redfield International Advisors. Harbor Point Development Services. I advanced again. Corporate registration documents appeared. These entities have no employees, offices, operating history, or legitimate clients. Each was registered through the same agent connected to a mailbox in Las Vegas. Gerald Whitmore stared at the screen. "When were they formed?" "Beginning 3 months after Douglas married Renee." Douglas struck the table with his palm. "This is fabricated." His voice was immediate and hard. "He has spent 2 weeks constructing a false case because he cannot accept that Mom did not trust him with the estate." I advanced the slide. 41 months of authorizations appeared. Each carried Douglas's digital signature. "Then explain those." His face changed. The board members turned toward him. I continued. "Every payment was deliberately kept below Stafford Capital's automatic secondary review threshold. Every authorization was executed using Douglas's credentials. My credentials were accessible to the finance department." Frank spoke for the first time. "The authentication logs show the approvals were made from your assigned devices using your biometric confirmation." Douglas looked at Renee. She stood. "Jean, I understand that you are grieving. Sit down." The authority in my voice stopped her. I had used that tone with suspects, attorneys, and executives who believed money made them immune to consequences. Renee had never heard it directed at her. She remained standing. "I am not finished." I activated the audio recording. Peggy's voice filled the conference room. 2 board members flinched. Gerald Whitmore pressed one hand against the table. Douglas's face lost its color. Frank had reduced the 47-minute conversation to 6 critical minutes. The questions. The admissions. Douglas acknowledging that the consulting companies lacked legitimate operations. His statement that Renee controlled the structure. His admission that he continued signing because he believed the money would eventually return to the family. His attempt to justify the theft as an advance against an inheritance he assumed would someday become his. When the recording ended, the room was so quiet that I could hear air moving through the ventilation system. I advanced to the international transfer diagram. The stolen funds were routed through Panama, divided among Swiss accounts, and reconsolidated into a Cayman Islands trust. The trust document appeared. Beneficiaries, Douglas Allen Stafford and Renee Marie Stafford. Gerald read the ownership distribution. 60% Renee. 40% Douglas. No one spoke. I turned toward Renee. Even in the account you created together, you made certain you controlled him." Her expression did not change. But her eyes did. The calm certainty disappeared. In its place was calculation. How much did I know? Who else knew? Could the evidence be challenged? Was the exit still available? I changed the slide. The payments to Pacific Health Consulting Partners appeared. There is more. Renee's hand moved toward her briefcase. Stafford Capital paid $1.5 million to a medical consulting entity controlled by Dr. Gerald Finch. The board's chief financial officer frowned. Why would the company pay a medical consultant that amount? That is an excellent question. I displayed Finch's registration history and the medication record. Dr. Finch was brought into Margaret's care 3 weeks before her death. He discontinued a medication prescribed by her cardiologist and replaced it with another carrying a serious warning for patients with her medical history. I avoided naming the drug publicly. The investigators and medical experts would handle those details. The board needed only the connection. The replacement increased the known risk of the exact type of stroke she suffered. Renee pushed back her chair. "This is outrageous." I advanced to her email. September 18th. 19 days before Peggy died. Margaret is asking more questions than expected about the third quarter disbursements. The timeline needs to move faster. We are running out of room. The email appeared in large text. Gerald Whitmore read it twice. Then he turned toward Renee. "What timeline?" She did not answer. What did that mean? It referred to the board presentation. Then why was it sent to her physician? Renee looked toward the door. Her calculation ended. She moved quickly. The chair rolled backward. She grabbed her briefcase and stepped toward the exit. Before she reached it, the door opened. Clara Hutchins entered first. She held the original will in a sealed legal envelope. Sandra Kowalski followed. Her chin was raised. Her hands remained steady. 2 months earlier, she had been frightened into signing an agreement and accepting silence as the price of protecting her family. Now she walked into the room as a federal witness. Thomas Briggs entered behind her. His badge was held at chest height. 4 agents spread through the conference room. 2 moved toward Renee. 2 approached Douglas. Briggs spoke with the calm authority of a man completing an operation that had already been decided by evidence and law. "Renee Stafford and Douglas Stafford, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy." Douglas released a sound I had never heard from him. A short, broken breath. Like a man walking confidently across frozen water who suddenly hears the ice crack beneath him. His hands closed around the edge of the table. His face collapsed. For one moment, he looked like the boy I remembered. Confused. Afraid. Waiting for his parents to explain how the world could be made safe again. But Peggy was gone. And the danger had come from him. Renee made no sound. She stood perfectly still as an agent placed her hands behind her back. The handcuffs closed around her wrists. She looked directly at me. Her expression was colder than anger. It held accusation, hatred, and disbelief that the man she had dismissed as an aging widower had dismantled the structure she spent years building. She held my eyes for 3 seconds. Then she looked away. That was the moment her composure broke. Not through shouting. Not through tears. Certainty simply disappeared from her face. She had calculated every person around her. Peggy. Douglas. The board. The employees. The attorneys. She had studied their ambitions, insecurities, loyalties, and fears. But she had miscalculated me. She had seen grief and mistaken it for helplessness. She had seen age and mistaken it for weakness. She had seen love for my son and assumed it would prevent me from following the evidence. Warren Lyle pressed himself against the wall. His settlement agreement remained on the table. Unsigned. The pen beside it. 2 agents approached him in the hallway. "Mr. Lyle, you are being detained for questioning concerning the submission of potentially fraudulent documents and possible witness intimidation." His face emptied of color. "I want my attorney." The irony was not lost on anyone. "You may contact counsel after we complete the initial processing instructions." Across the city, another FBI team entered Dr. Finch's private clinic on Wiltshire Boulevard. I learned later that he attempted to delete medical records when agents entered. The deletion was unsuccessful. The server had already been imaged remotely under warrant. I removed the original memory card from my jacket. Then I placed it on the conference table in front of Briggs. Everything Peggy collected is there. He did not touch it immediately. An evidence technician photographed the card in place. Only after documenting its condition did she seal it inside a protective bag. The procedure mattered. Peggy had spent 6 months building the case. We would not allow careless handling to give a defense attorney an opening. Gerald Whitmore remained seated at the head of the table. His eyes were wet. He stared at the screen, where the transfer diagram remained visible. "She built this company," he said. His voice was almost too quiet to hear. "Margaret built all of it." "Yes. And we allowed them to steal from her. You trusted people she wanted to trust. We should have seen it." "So should I." He looked at me. "The board owes you an apology." "The board owes Peggy an apology." Gerald lowered his head. "You are right." The agents began escorting Douglas from the room. By then, he was crying. Real tears. Not the measured grief he displayed during the funeral. Not the emotional performance from the social media video. These tears came from the sudden destruction of the world he believed he controlled. At the doorway, he turned. "Dad?" The word stopped me. For the first time since Peggy died, he sounded like my son. Not an executive. Not Renee's husband. Not the man accusing me publicly. Just Douglas. I looked at him. He waited. Perhaps he expected anger. Perhaps forgiveness. Perhaps one final rescue. I had nothing I could give him in that moment. So I said nothing. His face tightened. Then the agents guided him into the hallway. Renee never looked back. The sound of the handcuffs stayed with me. A small mechanical click. Nothing dramatic. But inside that sound were 31 years of Peggy's work. A company built from a rented room and a legal pad. Thousands of decisions. Employees hired. Risks taken. Contracts earned. Long evenings. Early mornings. And 2 people deciding that what she created belonged to them simply because they wanted it. The same click contained every hour Frank and I spent in the motel. Every document Sandra preserved. Every risk Peggy took. Everything narrowed into one quiet sound of a lock closing. 3 weeks later, on November 11th, I entered courtroom 7 of the Los Angeles Superior Court Probate Division. Clara sat beside me. She wore a gray suit and carried the original will inside the blue legal folder. The hearing lasted approximately 40 minutes. Douglas and Renee had been indicted on federal charges and remained in custody awaiting trial. Their attorneys filed an objection to Peggy's final will. They argued that its timing suggested improper influence and that Peggy had been emotionally distressed. Judge Patricia Serrano asked one question. Who is alleged to have improperly influenced Mrs. Stafford into leaving her estate to her husband of 31 years? The attorney attempted to answer. The judge stopped him. She reviewed Clara's affidavit, the witness statements, the independent notarization, Peggy's medical records at the time of signing, and the forfeiture clause. Then she ruled. The final will was valid. The emergency order freezing my accounts had been based on incomplete and misleading representations submitted by Warren Lyle. It was vacated. My access to all personal and estate accounts was restored. The Pasadena residence returned to my control. Peggy's shares in Stafford Capital passed to me immediately. The $60 million in the Callaway Reserve account remained protected pending final federal forfeiture proceedings connected to the criminal case. Judge Serrano signed the order at 11:47 in the morning. The same time I had initiated Peggy's requested transfer on the night after her funeral. Clara noticed the time. Neither of us commented. Some coincidences are better allowed to remain quiet. Outside the courthouse, November sunlight covered the steps. Clara squeezed my arm briefly. "You can go home now." The sentence nearly stopped me. Home. For weeks, the word had referred to a house I could not enter. A kitchen without Peggy. A property my son attempted to take. Now it belonged to me again. But ownership and home are not always the same thing. I thanked Clara. Then I drove to Pasadena alone. The iron gates opened when my car approached. Frank had helped install a new security system after the court issued its preliminary order. The system recognized the transponder. I drove slowly up the familiar driveway. The hydrangeas along the southern fence had recovered from the summer heat. The kitchen window caught the afternoon sun and cast a rectangle of gold across the front path. I remained in the car for several minutes. The house appeared unchanged. That seemed impossible. The world inside it had ended, yet the roof remained where it had always been. The windows reflected the same sky. Leaves had gathered near the steps. A delivery flyer rested beneath one corner of the doormat. I got out. Clara had arranged for a locksmith to replace every lock. I inserted the new key. Then I opened the door. The house smelled like itself. Old wood. Books. The faint trace of rosemary that may have existed only in my memory. And something I could not name because my body recognized it before my mind did. Home. I walked through the foyer. Past the living room. Past the fireplace where the clock had stood. Into the kitchen. Peggy's apron remained on the hook beside the refrigerator. Blue linen with small embroidered sunflowers. She had purchased it from a farmer's market in Ohio 3 summers earlier. She wore it perhaps twice. Then kept it because she liked the way it looked hanging in the kitchen. The strings were tied in a loose half bow. The kind of knot made by someone expecting to return and wear it again. I stood in the doorway for a long time. Then I filled the kettle. I placed it on the stove. I opened the cabinet and reached automatically for 2 cups. 31 years of marriage teaches your hands habits before your mind becomes involved. I looked at the second cup. For several seconds, I considered returning it. Instead, I placed both on the counter. I was not ready to stop reaching for 2. Perhaps I did not need to be ready. I sat at the table. Outside, 2 mockingbirds argued loudly in the hydrangeas. Their disagreement seemed deeply important to them. The kettle began to whistle. I looked toward the empty chair. "I'm home, Peggy." The kitchen did not answer. The birds continued their argument. Afternoon light moved gradually across the floor. The world continued in its dependable, indifferent way. For that day, it was enough. January arrived in Pasadena without ceremony. There was no snow. No frozen river. No dramatic temperature change marking the new year. Only a cooler quality in the morning light. A clarity that summer haze makes people forget is possible. During the second week of January, I noticed new growth appearing on the roses along the south fence. I stood at the kitchen window with coffee and thought Peggy would have noticed 3 days earlier. She would have pointed out the exact shade of green. I would have nodded without looking carefully. She would have known I was not looking. And she would have decided not to correct me because 31 years of marriage provides a detailed map of which small battles deserve energy. I missed her differently by then. The grief was no longer an emergency announcing itself every minute. It had settled into something permanent. A steady ache incorporated into ordinary life. It lived beside breakfast. Mail. Traffic. Work. Sleep. It did not demand constant attention. It required only acknowledgement. I finished my coffee and prepared to leave the house. By then, the criminal cases had advanced. Douglas accepted a federal plea agreement in December. He received a 22-year sentence for wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and participation in a scheme that deliberately endangered his mother. Under the agreement, he would serve at least 15 years before becoming eligible for any form of supervised release consideration. When Briggs told me, I felt no satisfaction. Only a deep exhaustion. 22 years was a number. It could not explain how a child raised inside a loving home became a man capable of signing away his mother's safety. Renee refused to negotiate. She went to trial. The proceeding lasted 11 days. The prosecution presented the financial records, Peggy's recording, Sandra's testimony, the medical evidence, and the emails connecting Renee to Dr. Finch. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 20 minutes. They found her guilty on every major count. She received 28 years. The most serious conspiracy count connected her payment to Finch with the medication change and the sequence leading to Peggy's fatal stroke. Dr. Gerald Finch surrendered his medical license. He pleaded guilty to fraud, unlawful financial arrangements, obstruction, and criminal medical negligence. He awaited sentencing in federal custody. Warren Lyle was permanently disbarred by the California State Bar. He later faced federal charges connected to fraudulent court filings, obstruction, and attempts to intimidate Sandra. I did not attend the trials. Some people expected me to. They believed I would want to see justice delivered personally. But the conference room had been enough. I did not need to watch Douglas stand before another judge. I did not need to hear Renee's attorneys describe Peggy as confused. Briggs kept me informed. That was sufficient. The $60 million became the initial funding for the Peggy Stafford Foundation. Her planning notes had been stored in Clara's file. The foundation's purpose was not complicated. It would provide financial and legal support to older adults facing exploitation by family members, caregivers, business partners, or people using claims of diminished capacity to seize control of their property. Peggy had written, "Age should not be treated as evidence of incompetence. Grief should not be treated as consent. Family should not be allowed to become a legal weapon." Those sentences became the foundation's guiding principles. We leased the second floor of a building on Colorado Boulevard, 4 blocks from Clara's office. The space had previously housed an architecture firm. It still smelled faintly of drafting paper and coffee. Frank spent 2 weeks painting the offices himself. I told him we could hire professionals. He told me to mind my own business. He was correct. By January, Frank served as the foundation's financial investigations director. He claimed the title was unnecessarily formal. Then he ordered business cards displaying it in large print. Sandra joined the advisory board. At first, she worked only part-time. She helped establish procedures for employees who discovered fraud inside family-owned companies. She also developed educational material explaining that non-disclosure agreements cannot lawfully silence reports of criminal activity. One Tuesday morning, I entered the office and found Frank seated behind a desk covered in controlled disorder. Stacks of folders. Coffee cups. A calculator. 3 pairs of reading glasses, despite his insistence that he owned only one. He looked up. The board approved the California Legal Aid Partnership. When? This morning. How many counties? 3 by March. More if the pilot succeeds. Good. He wrote something on a yellow pad. Sandra called. What does she need? She wants the foundation to create a victim advocacy program specifically for employees pressured into signing coercive non-disclosure agreements. Tell her yes. She has not submitted a proposal. Tell her to write one. I already did. Then why are you asking me? I enjoy allowing you to believe decisions require your approval. I sat across from him. Frank studied me over the top of his glasses. I recognized the expression. He had something to ask that was not related to work. How are you today? I'm going to the cemetery. He nodded. Take the white roses from the back garden. I plan to. She preferred those to flowers from the shop. I know. He continued looking at me. What? Nothing. You have never looked at anyone that long without having an opinion. I was deciding whether to come with you. No. All right. He accepted the answer without offense. Frank understood that grief sometimes requires company. And sometimes requires privacy. Mountain View Cemetery sits in the foothills above Pasadena. From the upper paths, the San Gabriel Mountains appear close enough to touch. In January, snow covered the highest peaks. I had visited Peggy's grave twice since the funeral. Once in November. Once in December. Both times, I stayed longer than planned. I eventually understood that this was not a problem. Time behaves differently in cemeteries. No one is expected to hurry. Peggy's grave was located along the eastern path beneath an old sycamore. The tree had dropped most of its leaves but held several stubbornly, as though refusing to accept that the season had changed. I carried white roses from our garden. I arranged them beside the headstone. Then I sat on the nearby bench. The wood was cold through my jacket, but not unpleasant. For a while, I said nothing. Then I told her about the foundation. I described Frank's painting project. The smell of drafting paper. The new legal aid partnership. Sandra's plan for employees trapped by coercive agreements. She would have improved the proposal within 5 minutes, I said. Wind moves through the sycamore. I told Peggy about the new growth on the roses. About the mockingbirds continuing their territorial dispute. About my unsuccessful attempt to cook her rosemary roast. I had followed the written recipe exactly. It tasted nothing like hers. You clearly omitted an instruction, I told the headstone. Then I reached inside my jacket. The sessions clock rested in my hand. I had repaired the back panel after federal investigators returned it. The brass was cool. The trademark was worn. The narrow seam remained visible along the lower edge. I would never again look at it without seeing the memory card sealed in plastic. Without hearing Peggy's recorded voice. Without remembering the trust she placed in me. I held the clock for several minutes. Then I set it beside the white roses. I think this belongs here. The wind moved again. Somewhere below us, Pasadena continued its ordinary business. Cars moved. People opened stores. Children entered classrooms. Someone was probably sitting at a kitchen table believing an ordinary morning would remain ordinary. I rested my hands on my knees. Beneath the grief, beside it, and threaded through it was something I had not expected to feel so soon. Gratitude. For 31 years. For a conference in San Francisco. For Monday dinners. For Carmel. For the garden. For the clock. For the complete trust Peggy placed in me while sitting across from me with cold hands and frightened eyes. She had known the burden she was giving me. She had known what it would cost. And she believed I would not drop it. I had not dropped it. That was enough. It would always be enough. I stood. I brushed the dust and cold from my jacket. Then I walked down the cemetery path toward the gate. Toward the city. Toward the foundation. Toward the house where white roses were beginning their slow return along the southern fence. A house that was still home. Not because nothing painful had happened there. But because love had existed there longer than betrayal. I would not wish my family's story on anyone. When Peggy died, she left more than grief. She left an antique clock. A memory card. A legal plan. And the most complete act of trust I have ever received from another human being. I believe certain people enter our lives not to make the road easy, but to prepare us for what the road will eventually require. Peggy was that person for me. She challenged me. Corrected me. Loved me. And trusted me to remain the man she knew, even after losing her. From everything this betrayal cost me, I learned one lesson I want you to remember. Pay attention to the people sitting at your table. Do not judge them only by the words they use when everyone is watching. Notice what they do when they believe no one will question them. Notice how they treat employees, older relatives, waiters, assistants, and people who cannot advance their ambitions. Notice whether affection disappears when money enters the conversation. Notice whether concern becomes control. Whether help becomes authority. Whether a family member begins isolating someone while claiming it is for that person's protection. I missed signs. Some were subtle. Others I ignored because believing the truth would have required accepting something painful about my son. Do not repeat my mistake. Love should make us compassionate. It should not make us blind. Our story ended with legal justice. But justice came late. It came after Peggy was gone. After a son betrayed his parents. After employees were frightened. After a company nearly collapsed. No sentence, court ruling, or restored account can return what family betrayal takes. That is the truth people rarely discuss. Winning does not erase the cost of the fight. You may recover the home, the money, the reputation. But trust does not return in the same form. Some losses become part of you. The goal is not to pretend they never happened. The goal is to carry them without allowing them to destroy everything that remains. Peggy's final instruction was not merely to expose the truth. It was to live afterward. That has been the harder assignment. Finishing the case required evidence, patience, and experience. Living requires something less familiar. Acceptance. Help. Ordinary mornings. Real meals. Conversations with friends. Roses beginning to grow again. When I returned from the cemetery that afternoon, I entered the kitchen and reached for 2 cups. I stopped. Then I smiled. I left the second cup inside the cabinet. Not because I loved Peggy less. Not because I had moved beyond her. You do not move beyond 31 years. You carry them forward. I poured 1 cup of tea. Then I sat beside the window and watched the afternoon light move across the floor. The mockingbirds argued outside. Somewhere in the house, the antique clock was absent from its place on the mantel. For the first time, The empty space did not feel like a wound. It felt like a marker. Evidence that something precious had been there. Evidence that it had mattered. Evidence that love, unlike money, cannot be stolen simply because someone finds a clever way to transfer ownership. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you had discovered that your own child was helping someone steal from your family. Would you have confronted them immediately? Would you have waited and gathered evidence? Or would love have made it impossible to act? Share this story with someone who needs its lesson. And subscribe for more stories about family, betrayal, courage, and the quiet strength it takes to stand up when the people closest to you mistake kindness for weakness. This story includes fictionalized elements created for entertainment and reflection. Any resemblance to actual individuals, companies, legal cases, or medical events is coincidental. But the warning behind it is real. Protect the people you love. Protect your records. Ask questions. And never allow anyone to convince you that growing older means surrendering control over your own life. Peggy once told me that a life should not be measured only by what a person leaves behind. It should be measured by what becomes possible because that person was here. Because Peggy was here, a company survived. Employees were protected. A fraud was exposed. And a foundation now helps older people who might otherwise face the same kind of exploitation alone. Because she was here, I became capable of finishing what she started. And because she trusted me, I eventually became capable of beginning again. That is where my story ends. Not in the courtroom. Not in the conference room. Not with handcuffs closing around the wrists of the people who betrayed us. It ends in a quiet kitchen in Pasadena. With one cup of tea. Afternoon sunlight. White roses returning along the fence. And the understanding that grief and gratitude can occupy the same heart without canceling each other. I still miss her. I always will. But I am living. Just as she asked me to.